first movement in the chronicle of the Commonwealth begins not with the scream of sirens or the blinding flash of atomic fire, but with the haunting, domestic stillness of a Saturday morning in Sanctuary Hills. It was a day of synthetic perfection, where the hum of a robotic butler and the smell of fresh coffee acted as a fragile shield against the mounting geopolitical dread that permeated the airwaves of 2077. For the veteran of the Sino-American War and his family, the world was a collection of clean lines and suburban promises, a life earned through service and anchored by the simple, rhythmic breathing of a child in a wooden crib. This initial chapter of the legend is defined by the veneer of the pre-war, a period where the high technology of the mid-21st century had reached its zenith, providing a life of convenience that masked the hollow reality of a planet gasping its final breaths of oil and stability. The atmosphere was one of forced normalcy, a desperate clinging to the routine of breakfast and neighborhood chatter, while the shadow of the mushroom cloud already loomed over the horizon of the American dream. When the broadcast finally cut through the morning air, it was not a surprise so much as a confirmation of a long-suppressed fear, and the frantic sprint toward the local Vault-Tec facility marked the true beginning of the descent. The path to Vault 111 was a chaotic blur of panicked neighbors and military cordons, a final look at a world that was being systematically dismantled in real time. As the elevator platform began its slow drop into the earth, the first blast detonated over Boston, a thermal pulse that vaporized the lush greens of the valley and replaced them with a searing, radioactive white. For those on the platform, the world did not end with a bang, but with a mechanical hum as the massive gear door of the vault sealed them away from the sky. This was the era of the Great Deception, where the promise of safety offered by Vault-Tec was revealed to be a cold, clinical laboratory of human endurance. The residents were not being saved. They were being preserved like specimens in a jar, stripped of their names and identities to become subjects in a long-term cryogenic experiment. Inside the sterile, blue-lit halls of the vault, the family was ushered into pods, the frost creeping across the glass as the world outside turned to ash. The first part of this history is a story of frozen time, a century-long silence where the protagonist existed as a ghost within a machine, unaware of the passing of decades or the slow decay of the facility around them. The silence was only broken by a singular, violent intrusion, a moment of waking nightmare where the glass was cleared of frost not by a technician, but by a predator. The protagonist watched, paralyzed by the remnants of the cryosleep, as a bald man with the eyes of a shark stepped out of the shadows to seize the child from his mother's arms. The struggle was brief and brutal, ending with a gunshot that echoed through the cold chamber like the cracking of the world itself. The thief vanished back into the dark. The pod refroze, and the protagonist was plunged back into a dreamless void, now haunted by the image of a lost son and a murdered spouse. The awakening that followed was the true birth of the sole survivor, a mechanical failure in the life support systems that forced the protagonist out into a tomb of rusted metal and skeletal remains. Walking through the ruins of Vault 111 was a lesson in the cruelty of the New World. The scientists had long since turned on each other, and the high-tech sanctuary had become a graveyard of failed ambition. As the heavy door finally groaned open to let in the light of 2287, the protagonist did not find the green hills of their memory, but a jagged, skeletal landscape of brown earth and twisted steel. The sun was a pale, sickly thing hanging over a world that had spent 2 centuries rotting in its own filth. This was the moment of the first breath, where the air of the wasteland, thick with the scent of radiation and old dust, filled the lungs of a man out of time. Standing on the ridge overlooking what was once sanctuary hills, the sole survivor looked down at the wreckage of their life. The houses were ribs of rotted wood. The trees were blackened claws reaching for a dead sky, and the silence was no longer the peace of a Saturday morning, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a hunting ground. This first movement of the chronicle establishes the primary motivation for everything to come: the desperate, singular need to find the child in a world that no longer recognizes the concept of family. The protagonist began the descent into the valley, their pre-war clothing a bright, mocking blue against the grime of the Commonwealth. Every step away from the vault was a step further into a reality where the old laws had been replaced by the brutal necessity of the scavenge. The journey was no longer about service to a country, but about the survival of a soul in a landscape that had forgotten how to hope. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth was a tapestry of the beautiful decay, where the remnants of the old world, the rusted cars, the flickering neon of Nuka-Cola signs, and the crumbling statues of patriots served as the bones for a new, predatory ecosystem. As the sole survivor reached the bridge leading into their old neighborhood, they encountered the first companion of the road, a dog whose loyalty was untainted by the cynicism of the wastes. This encounter marked the transition from the isolation of the vault to the communal struggle of the surface. The first part of the legend ends with the protagonist standing in the kitchen of their ruined home, looking at the faded photographs of a life that had been vaporized in a single morning. The mission was clear, the path was dangerous, and the world of the Commonwealth was waiting to see if a relic of the past could survive the terrors of the future. The search for Sean had begun, and with it, the slow, bloody reconstruction of a broken hero. The second movement in the saga of the Commonwealth leads the sole survivor away from the hollowed-out remains of Sanctuary Hills and toward the historic town of Concord, a place where the ghosts of the American Revolution meet the desperate, bloody reality of the post-apocalypse. As the protagonist crossed the bridge, leaving behind the ruins of their former life, the atmosphere shifted from personal grief to the broader, chaotic struggle for existence that defines the wasteland. The air was filled with the distant, sharp reports of pipe rifle fire, and the frantic shouts of people cornered by predators. This chapter of the journey is defined by the first intervention, the moment where the man out of time was forced to trade the domesticity of the past for the lethal instincts of a combat veteran. The town of Concord, once a site of patriotic pride, was now a labyrinth of crumbling brick and barricaded storefronts, a battlefield where the last remnants of the Minutemen were being systematically hunted by a gang of raiders who saw the world as nothing more than a buffet of violence and scrap. Upon reaching the Museum of Freedom, the sole survivor encountered Preston Garvey, a man carrying the weight of a dying ideal upon his shoulders. Preston represented the flicker of the old guard, the last vestige of a volunteer militia that once stood for the protection of the common people. The situation was dire. Trapped on the museum's upper balcony with a handful of terrified civilians, the Minutemen were outgunned and surrounded. It was here that the protagonist was introduced to the iconic silhouette of the T-45 power armor, a rusted, clanking relic of the pre-war military, perched atop the museum's roof like a gargoyle of a forgotten age. Stepping into the frame of the armor was a transformative experience. The mechanical whir of the servos and the heavy thud of the boots provided a sense of security that the thin fabric of a vault suit could never offer. For a brief moment, the protagonist was no longer a displaced father, but a walking tank, a vessel of iron and fire ready to impose order on a world of chaos. The battle that erupted in the streets of Concord was the baptism of lead, a frantic, high-stakes introduction to the lethality of the Commonwealth. Armed with a portable minigun torn from the crashed vertibird on the roof, the sole survivor descended into the street, the spinning barrels of the weapon raining a hailstorm of 5 rounds upon the raiders. But the true terror of the wasteland was waiting beneath the asphalt. As the gunfire reached a fever pitch, the ground buckled and cracked, and from the sewers emerged a deathglow, a biological nightmare of the old world's military laboratories, a creature of pure muscle, obsidian scales, and claws as long as knives. The appearance of the beast changed the nature of the encounter from a skirmish to a struggle for survival. The deathclaw moved with a horrifying, predatory grace, weaving through the rusted husks of cars and shrugging off small arms fire with indifferent ease. The struggle against the deathclaw was a lesson in the new hierarchy, where the protagonist realized that even with the might of pre-war technology, they were no longer at the top of the food chain. The fight was a dance of desperation, the power armor's plating being shredded by the creature's swipes, while the minigun chewed through the beast's tough hide. When the monster finally fell, its massive body slumping into the dust of the Concord streets, a heavy silence settled over the town. The raiders were dead or scattered, and the civilians in the museum were safe, but the victory felt fragile. The sole survivor stood amidst the wreckage, the cooling barrels of the minigun smoking in the damp air, realizing that the world they had awakened to was one that required constant, brutal vigilance. The hero of Concord was a title born of blood and steel, a role the protagonist had not asked for, but was now forced to inhabit. After the adrenaline of the battle faded, the conversation with Preston Garvey and the eccentric, chem-addled Mama Murphy provided the first clues to the larger mystery of the Commonwealth. Mama Murphy, through her sight, spoke of a great clockwork and a child hidden in a city of diamonds, a cryptic breadcrumb that pointed toward the ruins of Boston. This was the moment of the strategic pivot, where the search for Sean became linked with the fate of the people of the Commonwealth. Preston, seeing the potential in the warrior who had saved them, offered the protagonist a chance to rebuild the Minutemen, to turn Sanctuary Hills from a graveyard into a fortress. It was a trade of services. The sole survivor would provide the muscle and leadership, and the Minutemen would provide the eyes and ears across the wasteland. The second movement of the chronicle ends with the small group of survivors beginning their trek back towards Sanctuary Hills, their meager belongings piled on the back of a pack Brahmin. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the scorched earth, and for the first time, the protagonist felt the stirrings of a new purpose. They were no longer just a subject of Vault 111. They were a player in the grand, unfolding drama of the wastes. The road ahead was long, and the threat of the Institute, the mysterious boogeyman of the Commonwealth, mentioned in hushed tones by the survivors, loomed over every thought. As they crossed the bridge back into the neighborhood, the sole survivor looked at the rusted houses and saw not what was lost, but what could be built. The first settlement was established, the first alliance was forged, and the hunt for the truth was moving toward the heart of the city. The third movement in the legend of the Commonwealth begins with the long, treacherous trek south toward the jagged skyline of the Boston ruins, a journey that marks the sole survivor's transition from a local protector to a true urban scavenger. Leaving the relative safety of the Minutemen at Sanctuary Hills, the protagonist navigated a landscape where the roads were no longer paths, but traps, lined with the rusted remains of pre-war commerce and the territorial markers of various warring factions. This chapter is defined by the urban gauntlet, a descent into the dense, vertical nightmare of the city's heart, where the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete, stagnant water, and the copper tang of old blood. As the skyscrapers of Boston loomed closer, their shattered windows reflecting a gray and uncaring sky, the protagonist realized that the open spaces of the North were a luxury. Here, in the shadows of the financial district, every alleyway held the potential for a confrontation with the super mutants, hulking, green-skinned abominations who viewed the human remains of the city as nothing more than meat and trophies. The arrival at Fenway Park, known to the locals as Diamond City, was the first moment of true civilization the sole survivor had encountered since waking from the frost. Entering through the massive, reinforced stadium gates was a jarring experience. Inside the great green jewel, the world was a bustling, neon-lit bazaar of repurposed scrap and suspicious glances. The stadium, once a place of sport and communal joy, had been transformed into a fortress of shacks and stalls, a testament to the human spirit's ability to cling to the earth even in the face of annihilation. This was the era of the City of Rumors, where the protagonist first felt the pervasive dread of the Institute. In the Dugout Inn and the local marketplace, the talk was not of the weather or the war, but of the synths, artificial humans who could look like a neighbor, a friend, or a spouse, and who could whisk a person away in the dead of night, never to be seen again. The atmosphere of Diamond City was one of guarded hope and deep-seated paranoia, and it was here that the search for Sean took its first concrete step. Through the sharp-tongued reporter Piper Wright and the city's weary inhabitants, the protagonist learned of the only man in the Commonwealth capable of finding someone who didn't want to be found: the private investigator, Nick Valentine. However, the revelation came with a catch. The detective had recently gone missing while investigating a case at Park Street Station. This led the sole survivor into the subterranean hunt, a descent into the pre-war subway tunnels that had been overtaken by the Triggermen, a gang of pre-war obsessed mobsters who dressed in suits and fedoras, wielding submachine guns with a lethal, nostalgic flair. The transition from the bright lights of the stadium to the damp, flickering darkness of the tunnels was a reminder that in the Commonwealth, safety is always a narrow, temporary thing. Inside the ruins of Vault 114, hidden deep beneath the subway, the protagonist discovered the truth about the detective. Nick Valentine was not merely a man, but a prototype synth, a mechanical skeleton covered in tattered, synthetic flesh, possessing the memories and the weary personality of a pre-war police officer. This encounter was a pivotal moment in the shattering of prejudices, as the sole survivor was forced to reconcile their fear of the Institute's creations with the undeniable humanity of the man standing before them. Nick was a relic of the past in a more literal sense than the protagonist, his very existence a contradiction of the paranoia that gripped Diamond City. Together, they fought their way out of the vault, the detective's steady, mechanical calm providing a perfect foil to the protagonist's raw, driving desperation. The battle to escape Park Street Station was a frantic exercise in close-quarters attrition, where the echo of gunfire off the tiled walls was deafening, and the smoke from pipe pistols filled the air like a localized fog. Nick Valentine moved with the calculated efficiency of a machine, but spoke with the dry, cynical wit of a noir hero, creating a bond of mutual respect that would become the foundation of the protagonist's most enduring partnership. As they emerged back into the ruins of Boston, the detective agreed to take on the case of the missing child, recognizing in the sole survivor a mirror of his own displaced identity. This was the Allied Dawn, the point where the quest for Sean ceased to be a solitary obsession and became a professional investigation, backed by the experience of a man who had been walking the streets of the Commonwealth for decades. The third movement of the chronicle ends with the return to Diamond City, the protagonist and the synth detective walking side by side through the gates of the stadium. The investigation had a lead. The man with the scarred face who had stolen the child from the vault was a merc named Kellogg, and the trail led to a small, barricaded house in the city's residential stands. As the sun set over the stadium walls, casting long, geometric shadows over the green turf, the protagonist felt the first real spark of progress. The mystery was no longer a vast, formless void. It had a name, a location, and a detective to follow. The hunt for Kellogg was about to begin, and the sole survivor was no longer just a victim of history. They were the one catching up to it. The city of diamonds held many secrets, but for the first time, the path forward was lit by something more than just radiation. The fourth movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth centers on the investigation of the scar, a tense and methodical penetration into the private life of the man who had shattered the protagonist's world. In the narrow, tiered stands of Diamond City, the search for Sean became an exercise in forensic grit. As the sole survivor and Nick Valentine stood before the locked door of Kellogg's house, this chapter is defined by the transition from broad wasteland survival to the intimate, cold reality of a manhunt. The atmosphere within the city's residential district was thick with the silent judgment of the neighbors, people who had lived alongside a monster for years, too terrified of the Institute's reach to speak his name. When the door finally gave way, either through the protagonist's own mechanical skill or the detective's legal persistence, the interior revealed a sanctuary of professional coldness, a home that felt less like a living space and more like a staging ground for a ghost. The exploration of the house was a moment of proximal haunting. Every item found the discarded San Francisco sunlights, the stockpiles of ammunition, and the hidden button behind the desk painted a picture of a man who was as much a victim of the wasteland's brutality as he was its primary architect. This was the era of the cigar and the scent, where the protagonist's loyal companion, Dogmeat, became the primary engine of the search. By presenting the dog with a specific brand of cigar found in the secret room, the hunt shifted from the static confines of Diamond City to a linear pursuit across the broken heart of the Massachusetts countryside. The trail was a breadcrumb path of violence. Kellogg had not been hiding his tracks so much as he had been daring the world to follow him, leaving behind the bloody rags of wounded travelers and the charred remains of those who had stood in his way. As the duo and their canine tracker moved west, the landscape began to bleed into the highway of despair. The path followed the rusted tracks and the crumbling overpasses, moving through the shadow of the Corviga assembly plant and the gray, skeletal forests that clung to the hillsides. This part of the journey was a test of stamina and memory. as the sole survivor was forced to relive the trauma of the vault with every new clue the dog uncovered. The atmosphere was one of building pressure, a storm of vengeance gathering over the horizon. Nick Valentine provided a constant, grounding presence, his mechanical eyes scanning the tree lines for the glint of a sniper's scope, his weary voice offering the cynical comfort of a man who had seen 1,000 such hunts end in tragedy. They were no longer just travelers. They were the collective memory of the Commonwealth, chasing down a man who represented the absolute erasure of the past. The trail eventually led to the forbidding concrete bulk of Fort Hagen, a pre-war military installation that had been converted into a fortress of synths and steel. This was the moment of the Siege of the Soul, where the protagonist had to cut through waves of mechanical soldiers, the Institute's early model synths, who guarded the mercenaries' sanctuary with a mindless, robotic devotion. The interior of the fort was a labyrinth of flickering fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hum of heavy machinery, a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the surface. Kellogg's voice echoed over the intercom system, a raspy, indifferent taunt that sought to deconstruct the protagonist's resolve. He spoke of the inevitability of time and the futility of the search, attempting to frame himself not as a villain, but as a simple consequence of a world that had lost its moral compass. The confrontation in the depths of the command center was the climax of the vendetta. Standing face to face with the man who had pulled the trigger in the vault, the sole survivor found not a grand demon, but a tired, cybernetically enhanced survivor, whose eyes were filled with the same cold exhaustion as the protagonist's own. The battle was brief and devastatingly loud, the sound of explosives and heavy caliber gunfire reflecting off the concrete walls, until the air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt meat. When Kellogg finally fell, his cybernetic components sparking as his life ebbed away, the victory was hollow. The man was dead, but the child was still missing, and the only lead left was a piece of the mercenary's own brain, a memory socket that held the encrypted secrets of the Institute's most guarded facility. The fourth movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor emerging onto the roof of Fort Hagen, the cold wind of the heights whipping at their hair. As they looked toward the sky, the silence of the victory was shattered by a sight that changed the power dynamic of the Commonwealth forever. A massive, metallic roar filled the air as the Brotherhood of Steel's flagship, the Pridwin, drifted majestically over the ruins of Boston, flanked by swarms of vertibirds. It was the arrival of a new armored god, a declaration of war against the shadows of the Institute. The hunt for Sean had just become part of a much larger, much more dangerous conflict. The protagonist stood on the edge of the roof, the mercenaries' blood still on their hands, watching the birth of a new era of steel. The search would now lead into the very memories of the dead, as the world below prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of humanity itself. The fifth movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is a descent into the architecture of the mind, a journey that took the sole survivor from the physical ruins of the surface to the flickering, fragmented corridors of a dead man's memory. Following the fallout of the battle at Fort Hagen, the protagonist and Nick Valentine realized that the physical search for Sean had hit a technological wall. To find the entrance to the Institute, a place that existed in no known map or cellar, they had to harvest the cybernetic memories from Kellogg's brain. This chapter is defined by the transition to Goodneighbor, a town of criminal sanctity, hidden within the shadows of the old financial district. Goodneighbor was a place for the misfits, the ghouls, and the outcasts who found Diamond City too judgmental. It was a neon-soaked haven governed by the charismatic ghoul Mayor Hancock, where the smell of stale beer and the glow of radioactive chems created an atmosphere of desperate, beautiful rebellion. Inside the memory den, a velvet-lined sanctuary run by the enigmatic Dr. Amari, the quest for Sean took on a surreal, metaphysical quality. The atmosphere was one of the digital seance, as Nick Valentine offered himself as a host for the mercenary's memory chip, his own synthetic brain acting as the bridge to the past. The sole survivor was lowered into a sensory deprivation tank, their consciousness projected into a linear path of frozen moments, snapshots of Kellogg's life that stretched back to the pre-war era and across the wastes of the West Coast. This part of the history is a story of sympathy for the monster, as the protagonist was forced to walk through the traumatic milestones of the man they had just executed. They saw Kellogg as a child in a broken home, a young man losing his own wife and daughter to a gang of thugs, and finally, a cold instrument of the Institute, hollowed out by centuries of cybernetic enhancement and the loss of his own humanity. Walking through these ghostly tableaus, the protagonist experienced the crushing weight of the wasteland's recursive cruelty. They witnessed the moment Kellogg was recruited by the Institute in the ruins of San Francisco, and eventually, the very moment in Vault 111 when he had taken Sean. The atmosphere of the memoryscape was distorted and haunting, the colors bleeding together like wet ink on a page. The climax of the digital descent was the final memory, a small house in Diamond City where Kellogg had lived with a young boy, Sean. Here, the secret was finally whispered. The Institute did not use doors or tunnels. They used teleportation, a mastery of molecular relay that allowed them to pluck people from the surface and vanish without a trace. The only lead to bypassing this system lay with a rogue scientist named Virgil, who had fled the Institute and disappeared into the one place where even the synths feared to tread. The glowing sea, the fifth part of his history, is defined by this revelatory trauma. Emerging from the memory den, the sole survivor was no longer just a grieving parent. They were a witness to the tragic, cyclical nature of the Commonwealth's history. The connection with Nick Valentine deepened, but it was tainted by by the brief, terrifying moment when Kellogg's personality flickered through the detective's voice, a reminder that the dead never truly stay buried in a world of high technology. This was the era of the Forbidden Horizon, where the protagonist realized that to save their son, they would have to march into the heart of the world's most irradiated wasteland, the impact site of the primary nuclear warhead that had ended the world 2 centuries prior. The mission had shifted from a detective story to a pilgrimage through the valley of the shadow of death. As they left the neon warmth of Good Neighbor and stepped back into the gray, ash-choked air of Boston, the protagonist felt the true scale of the task ahead. They were hunting a ghost in a machine, and the only way forward was to seek counsel from a man who had turned himself into a monster to escape the light. This part of the journey ended with the sole survivor preparing for the trek to the southwest, checking the seals on their radiation suit and the ammunition in their rifle. The memory of the scar had provided the map, but it would take the spirit of the survivor to cross the hellscape that lay ahead. The Commonwealth watched in silence as the blue-clad figure turned their back on civilization, heading toward the yellow, toxic clouds of the glowing sea, where the truth was buried beneath a layer of eternal radiation. The 6th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is a journey into the heart of the atom, a harrowing pilgrimage across the glowing sea, the massive, cratered impact site where the primary nuclear warhead struck Boston 2 centuries ago. As the sole survivor left the relative safety of the urban ruins behind, the sky began to shift from a pale gray to a sickening, permanent shade of ochre. This chapter is defined by the transition into the ultimate wasteland, a landscape so thoroughly saturated with radiation that the very air hums with a lethal energy, and the earth has been melted into jagged, glass-like formations. The atmosphere was one of the living end, where the laws of nature had been replaced by the chaotic physics of the nuclear blast. To survive this trek, the protagonist had to sheath themselves in a lead-lined hazmat suit, or the heavy, pressurized frame of power armor, becoming a mechanical ghost walking through a world that was never meant to support human life again. The trek through the glowing sea was an exercise in auditory terror. The silence of the dead zone was broken only by the rhythmic, frantic clicking of the Geiger counter, a mechanical heartbeat that warned of invisible death lurking in every gust of wind. In this 6th part of the history, the protagonist encountered the children of Adam, a cult of radiation worshippers who had built a rickety wooden cathedral on the very lip of the blast crater. These zealots, immune or perhaps simply indifferent to the rot of their own cells, saw the glowing sea as a holy land, a place of great division, where the world was being purged for a new beginning. Their presence added a layer of spiritual madness to the physical horror of the landscape, reminding the sole survivor that in the absence of the old gods, the wasteland had birthed its own, more terrifying deities. The destination of this journey was the rocky cave, a lightless crevice hidden beneath a shelf of scorched granite, where the rogue scientist Virgil had established his laboratory. Finding Virgil was a moment of biological irony. The man who held the key to the Institute's inner sanctum was no longer a man at all, but a hulking, intellectual super mutant. To escape his former masters, Virgil had infected himself with a specialized strain of the forced evolutionary virus, trading his humanity for the physical resilience required to survive the radiation of the glowing sea. This encounter was the bridge of necessity, where the protagonist had to make a pact with a monster to defeat a machine. Virgil, driven by a mix of guilt and a desire for a cure, provided the technical specifications for the signal interceptor, a device capable of hijacking the Institute's molecular relay and pulling a traveler into their hidden subterranean city. The sixth part of his history is defined by this technological treason. The protagonist stood in the dim, chemical-scented light of the cave, looking at the schematics that would finally turn the tide of the search. However, the plan required more than just blueprints. It required a courser chip, a piece of high-grade hardware harvested from the Institute's most elite hunters. This meant that the sole survivor would have to return to the surface and hunt a creature designed specifically to be the ultimate predator of the Commonwealth. The atmosphere as they prepared to leave Virgil's sanctuary was one of the heavy burden, as the scientist reminded the protagonist that once they entered the Institute, there would be no going back to the simple life of a survivor. They were now a primary actor in a war that spanned dimensions of technology and ethics. The return journey across the glowing sea felt different. The yellow fog no longer felt like a barrier, but like a shroud for a rising warrior. The sole survivor moved with a new, grim purpose, the weight of the signal interceptor plans tucked into their armor. This part of the journey was the ascent from hell, as the protagonist emerged from the radioactive clouds back into the gray light of the Boston outskirts. They had looked into the face of the apocalypse and returned with the tools to dismantle the architects of the world's current misery. The sixth movement ended with the protagonist standing on the edge of the wastes, looking toward the ruins of the city. The hunt for the courser was next, and the mechanical gods of the Institute were finally about to feel the reach of the man they had thought was safely frozen in the past. The seventh movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the hunt for the hunter, a high-stakes pursuit that pits the sole survivor against the Institute's most terrifying creation, the courser. To activate the signal interceptor and bridge the gap between the surface and the subterranean city, the protagonist needed the courser chip, a piece of sophisticated hardware that served as the key to the molecular relay. This chapter is defined by the transition to the Greenatech Genetics Building, a pre-war facility of glass and steel that had become a vertical killing field. The atmosphere was one of calculated dread, as the protagonist followed the trail of a singular black-clad figure who was currently laying waste to a rival faction of gunners. The Courser, a model of synthetic perfection designed for the sole purpose of retrieval and termination, was not just a machine. It was the personification of the Institute's cold, inevitable reach. As the sole survivor entered the lobby of Greenatech, the carnage they encountered was a testament to the efficiency of the machine. The gunners, a well-equipped mercenary army that usually held the ruins with an iron grip, had been systematically dismantled. The corridors were littered with the bodies of elite soldiers, their high-tech weaponry and heavy armor proving useless against the Courser's surgical precision. This was the era of the vertical siege, where the protagonist had to fight through the remnants of the gunner defense, while hearing the distant, rhythmic discharge of the Courser's pulse rifle echoing down from the upper floors. The atmosphere was claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the static hum of active cloaking fields. Every step upward was a step closer to a confrontation with a predator that viewed the protagonist as nothing more than an obsolete variable. The confrontation at the summit of the building was the clash of the prototypes. The Courser, known as X688 or his contemporaries, moved with a speed and fluidity that defied human biology, using stealth boy technology to become a shimmering ghost in the peripheral vision. The battle was a frantic exercise in attrition and awareness, where the sole survivor had to rely on every combat reflex honed in the pre-war military and refined in the post-war wastes. The sound of high-energy beams melting through the concrete pillars and the frantic reload of ballistic weapons created a symphony of technological violence. When the Courser finally fell, its synthetic systems sparking and hissing as they reached critical failure, the protagonist stood over the cooling chassis, realizing that they had just defeated the Commonwealth's most feared boogeyman. This victory was the shattering of the myth, proving that even the Institute's perfect soldiers could be broken by a determined human will. Seventh part of his history is defined by this technological harvest. Standing over the fallen synth, the protagonist extracted the Courser chip, a small, glowing shard of circuitry that represented the culmination of 2 centuries of hidden research. This was the key to the kingdom, the final component required to build the signal interceptor. However, the chip was encrypted with a layer of code so complex that neither the Minutemen nor the scholars of Diamond City could hope to crack it. This led the protagonist to seek the assistance of the Railroad, a secretive, underground organization dedicated to the liberation of synths. Finding the Railroad was a journey into the shadows of the past, following the Freedom Trail through the historic heart of Boston, where the red brick of the American Revolution became a guide to a new kind of rebellion. Inside the basement of the Old North Church, under the flickering light of lanterns and the watchful eyes of Desdemona and the tactical genius Deacon, the protagonist found a faction that lived in a state of ideological siege. The Railroad represented the moral dilemma of the New World. Were the synths merely tools to be used and discarded, or were they a new branch of humanity deserving of freedom. By cracking the coarser chips code, the railroad's master hacker, Tom, provided the final bridge to the Institute. This was the unlocking of the gate, where the protagonist realized that the road to Sean would now require them to choose a side in a conflict that would determine the soul of the Commonwealth. The atmosphere in the hidden bunker was one of subterranean tension, a feeling that the secret war was finally coming into the light. The seventh movement of the Chronicle ends with the construction of the signal interceptor. Whether built in the ruins of Sanctuary Hills with the Minutemen, on the deck of the Pridwin with the Brotherhood, or in the hidden corners of the railroad's territory, the device was a massive, sparking monument to human ingenuity and desperation. As the beams began to hum and the air around the platform began to warp with the energy of the molecular relay, the sole survivor stood at the center of the machine, ready to be digitized and cast into the unknown. They were no longer just a survivor or a hunter. They were a pioneer entering the belly of the beast. The seventh part ended with a blinding flash of blue light and the sudden, terrifying silence of the relay. The surface was gone, and the protagonist was falling through the wires toward the heart of the Institute. The eighth movement in the saga of the Commonwealth is the shattering of the mirror, a moment of profound ontological shock that redefined the protagonist's mission and the very nature of their reality. As the blinding blue light of the molecular relay faded, the sole survivor did not find a den of monsters or a dark dungeon, but a vision of the subterranean utopia. The Institute was a marvel of white marble, flowing water, and synthesized sunlight, a high-tech paradise built in the ruins of the old world's basements. The atmosphere was one of clinical perfection, where the air was filtered to a purity that tasted alien to lungs accustomed to the dust of the wastes. This chapter is defined by the transition from the frantic violence of the surface to the eerie, sterilized calm of the Institute's central atrium, where scientists in clean lab coats moved with a quiet purpose that suggested they had already solved the problems of human suffering through the application of cold, hard logic. Following the instructions piped through the facility's intercom, the protagonist was led to a small, glass-walled room where a child sat on a bed. For a brief, heart-stopping second, the search seemed over. Here was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, who looked exactly like the memories the protagonist had carried since the freezing of the vault. But as the child began to scream, a mechanical, looping distress call, the illusion of the family, was violently torn away. The child was a synth, a prototype designed to test the limits of human emotional response. The true architect of the Institute, a man known only as Father, stepped out of the shadows to deactivate the boy with a single coded phrase. This was the moment of the final reveal, as the elderly man with the weary eyes and the sharp, academic features identified himself as the true Sean, the child taken from the vault 60 years ago, while the protagonist slept in a frozen dream. The atmosphere of this encounter was one of temporal vertigo. The protagonist was forced to reconcile the image of the infant they had lost with the man who now stood before them as the leader of the Commonwealth's most feared organization. Sean, or Father, explained the logic of the Institute, a philosophy that viewed the surface world as a failed experiment beyond salvation. In his eyes, the Institute was the only hope for humanity's future, a bastion of science and order that would eventually outlive the chaos of the wastes. This part of the history is a story of betrayal by time, where the hero realized that their son had been raised by the very monsters they had come to destroy. Sean did not see a parent. He saw a biological curiosity, a relic of the old world that he had released from the vault as a personal experiment to see if the spirit of the pre-war era could survive the rigors of the post-apocalypse. The eighth part of his history is defined by this moral crossroads. Father offered the protagonist a place within the Institute, inviting them to walk the halls as a member of the family rather than an intruder. This was the temptation of the light, where the sole survivor had to decide if they could look past the kidnappings, the murders, and the replacement of humans with synths for the sake of a relationship with a son they no longer knew. The atmosphere within the Institute became claustrophobic in a new way. It was no longer the fear of a courser's blade, but the weight of an intellectual trap. The protagonist toured the various divisions, the robotics labs, where synths were assembled like cars, the bioscience gardens, where extinct flora bloomed under artificial suns, and the advanced systems wings, where the weapons of the future were being forged. Every discovery was a double-edged sword, a miracle of science built upon a foundation of surface world misery. This period was also the meeting of the minds, as the protagonist encountered the heads of the Institute's divisions. These were people who viewed the people of Diamond City and the Minutemen as little more than variables in a grand equation. The connection between the parent and the son was strained by a fundamental disagreement over the value of human life. While the protagonist saw the resilience of the settlers and the bravery of the railroad, Father saw only the entropy of a dying world. The eighth movement reveals that the true conflict of the Commonwealth was not about resources or territory, but about the definition of humanity. By staying in the Institute, the protagonist was granted a glimpse into the potential of a world without radiation, but at the cost of turning their back on every friend they had made on the surface. The eighth movement of the chronicle ends with the protagonist standing on the observation deck, looking up at the ceiling that hid the sky. Father had given them a choice: join the Institute and help secure the future, or return to the surface as an enemy of progress. The hunt for Sean was technically over, but the search for purpose had only just begun. The protagonist felt the cold weight of the mercenary Kellogg's pistol at their hip, a reminder of the blood it had taken to reach this place. They had found their son, but they had lost their child, and the world above was waiting for a decision that would either save the Commonwealth or bury it forever under a layer of synthetic perfection. The 8th part ended with the sole survivor stepping back into the relay, the white light of the Institute fading as they prepared to tell their allies the truth about the man who wore the crown of the underground. The 9th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is defined by the weight of the secret, a period of agonizing political maneuvering where the sole survivor returned to the surface carrying a truth that threatened to shatter the resolve of every major power in the land. Emerging from the blinding relay of the Institute, the protagonist found themselves standing once more in the gray, wind-whipped ruins of Boston. But the landscape now looked different through the lens of their new knowledge. This chapter is characterized by the diplomatic fragmentation, as the hero was forced to report the identity of Father to the 3 factions vying for the soul of the wasteland. The atmosphere was one of escalating paranoia, where the simple quest for a lost child had ballooned into a world-ending conflict of ideologies. The protagonist was no longer just a searcher. They were a double agent, a kingmaker, and a harbinger of a coming storm that would force everyone to choose between the blood of the past and the cold logic of the future. The first stop on this journey of revelation was the Prydwen, the massive armored dirigible of the Brotherhood of Steel. Standing before Elder Maxson, a man whose zeal for the preservation of technology was matched only by his hatred for the synthetic, the protagonist delivered the news that the leader of the Institute was their own son. This was the moment of the Iron Ultimatum. To Maxson and the Brotherhood, Sean was not a person, but a biological aberration, a creator of the very abominations they had come to purge. The atmosphere on the flight deck was electric with tension, the hum of vertibird engines providing a backdrop to a conversation about the absolute necessity of genocide for the sake of humanity's purity. The sole survivor realized that to the Brotherhood, the family bond was a weakness that had to be cauterized. They expected their knight to prioritize the mission over the memory of the crib. The second report led the protagonist back to the flickering shadows of the Old North Church, where the railroad waited in a state of nervous anticipation. When Desdemona and the tactical chameleon Deacon heard the truth, the reaction was one of strategic terror. For the railroad, the news that Father was a human, and specifically the protagonist's son, changed the stakes of their infiltration. They saw an opportunity to use the family connection to stage a slave revolt from within the Institute's walls. But they feared the protagonist would be swayed by the siren's song of a comfortable life underground. This part of the history is a story of fractured loyalties, where the hero felt the tug of a revolutionary cause that treated synths as people, while knowing that their own flesh and blood was the one holding the shackles. The damp, candlelit bunker felt smaller than ever, a claustrophobic cage of ideals that demanded the protagonist betray their son to save a machine. Finally, the protagonist returned to the mud and wood of Sanctuary Hills to speak with Preston Garvey and the Minutemen. Here, the news was met with a weary pragmatism. To the common people of the Commonwealth, it didn't matter if the leader of the Institute was a long-lost son or a pre-war ghost. They only cared about the nightly disappearances and the fear that their neighbors were being replaced by plastic copies. Preston represented the voice of the soil, reminding the sole survivor that while the politics of the high-tech factions were complex, the duty to protect the settlements remained simple. This was the era of the home front dilemma, where the protagonist had to look into the eyes of the people they had sworn to protect and decide if they could lead a crusade against the man who carried half their DNA. The atmosphere in Sanctuary was one of quiet, domestic tragedy, a reminder of the Saturday morning that had started this entire nightmare. The ninth part of this history is defined by this triple-edged sword. The protagonist began to live a life of systemic deception, traveling back and forth between the surface and the Institute, feeding information to all sides while trying to find a path that didn't end in a radioactive crater. They were tasked with the Battle of Bunker Hill, a chaotic three-way skirmish that served as the first true explosion of the hidden war. In the shadow of the historic monument, the Brotherhood's power armor clashed with the Railroad's guerrilla tactics and the Institute's teleporting coursers, while the sole survivor moved through the crossfire like a ghost. The atmosphere of the battle was total entropic war, a sign that the time for secrets was over and the time for the Great Purge had arrived. The protagonist stood at the center of the carnage, realizing that they were the only person in the world who could see the humanity in every faction. Yet, they were being forced to destroy at least two of them. The ninth movement of the chronicle ends with a confrontation on the roof of the CIT ruins, overlooking the burning horizon of Boston. Father stood there, his back to the wind, disappointed by the outcome of the battle and the protagonist's perceived hesitation. He spoke of the inevitability of the Institute's victory and the failure of the surface, a speech that sounded more like a god judging a dead world than a son talking to a parent. The sole survivor looked out over the ruins and saw the flickering lights of the settlements they had built, the courage of the synths they had met, and the iron resolve of the soldiers they had led. The ninth part ended with a cold, clear realization. The hunt for Sean was officially dead, and the war for the Commonwealth had truly begun. The parent had to become the judge, and the next step would be the final choosing of a side that would paint the history of the wasteland in a singular, unchanging color. The 10th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is defined by the point of no return, a singular, harrowing moment where the luxury of neutrality vanished, and the sole survivor was forced to cast their lot with one of the competing visions for humanity's future. The atmosphere of the wasteland had reached a state of critical instability. The skirmish at Bunker Hill had acted as a catalyst, turning a cold war of shadows into a scorched earth campaign for total dominance. In this 10th part of the history, the protagonist realized that to remain a bridge between the surface and the subterranean city was to be crushed by both. The era of the Kingmaker began, where the veteran of the vault stood at the center of the world's scales, knowing that whichever side they weighted with their lead and their loyalty would be the one to inherit the ruins of Massachusetts. It was a choice between the ironclad purity of the Brotherhood, the clandestine liberation of the railroad, or the sterilized, scientific future of the Institute itself. As the protagonist stepped back into the world after the summit on the CIT roof, the weight of the Rubicon felt heavier than any power armor. For those who chose the path of the Brotherhood of Steel, the atmosphere was one of industrial zealotry. Elder Maxson demanded a total commitment to the ad victoriam creed, requiring the sole survivor to participate in the reactivation of Liberty Prime, a skyscraper-sized engine of destruction that viewed the world through the binary lens of democracy or annihilation. This was a story of the Steel Crusade, where the protagonist watched as the Brotherhood prepared to scour the Institute from the earth like a cancer. The connection to Sean was severed by the cold edge of military necessity. The father or mother had to become the paladin of the purge, acknowledging that the child they sought was long dead, replaced by a man whose ambitions threatened the genetic sanctity of the human race. Conversely, for those who found their heart in the subterranean rebellion of the railroad, the 10th part of the history was a masterclass in high-stakes infiltration. The protagonist became a Trojan horse, returning to the Institute not as a parent, but as a saboteur. Under the guidance of Desdemona and the code talker Liam Bennett, the mission shifted to Project Burning Cover, a desperate plan to coordinate a mass synth uprising. The atmosphere was one of quiet lethality. As the sole survivor moved through the white halls of the Institute, planting the seeds of a revolt that would see the very floors of the paradise run red with the oil and blood of its creators. Every conversation with Sean became a psychological duel, a dance of dutiful deception, where the protagonist had to look their son in the eye and lie about their loyalty, while the countdown to the explosion began in the shadows of the reactor. If the protagonist chose to embrace the legacy of the Institute, the 10th movement became a story of the ascension. Sean, his health failing from a terminal illness he could not cure with all his science, named the sole survivor as his successor. This was the burden of the director, where the protagonist was tasked with securing the Institute's power once and for all by eliminating the threats on the surface. The atmosphere was one of clinical utilitarianism, as the hero led a strike force to the Old North Church or the deck of the Prydwen to extinguish the lights of the opposition. To choose the Institute was to accept the logic of the void, the belief that the people of the Commonwealth were already ghosts, and that the only thing worth saving was the data and the technology held within the white walls. The parent finally became the child's protector, but at the cost of the world they had helped rebuild on the surface. The 10th part of this history is defined by this irreversible fracture. Regardless of the choice made, the protagonist had to commit a primal betrayal. To save the synths, they had to destroy their son's life's work. To save the human race via the Brotherhood, they had to commit a localized genocide. To save the Institute, they had to murder their friends. This was the era of the solitary commander, where the hero realized that leadership in the wasteland was not about making the right choice, but about living with the consequences of the only choice available. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth shifted to one of active siege as the factions began to move their heavy assets into position for the final confrontation. The signal interceptor, once a tool of desperate hope, was now the focal point for a mechanical invasion that would rewrite the laws of the land forever. The 10th movement of the chronicle ends with the commencement of the final offensive. Whether it was the thundering footsteps of Liberty Prime marching through the ruins of Boston, the frantic signal for the synth slave revolt, or the teleportation of a courser army into the heart of the Brotherhood's base, the war had finally reached its terminal velocity. The sole survivor stood at the vanguard of their chosen army, their eyes hardened by the realization that the past was truly dead. The Saturday morning in Sanctuary Hills was now a prehistoric myth. The reality was the cold steel of the rifle and the flickering light of the relay. The 10th part ended as the first explosions of the final battle illuminated the night sky, a signal that the Commonwealth was about to be reborn in fire, and the man out of time was the one holding the torch. The 11th movement in the chronicle of the Commonwealth is the rupture of the earth, the final, devastating offensive into the heart of the Institute that would decide the fate of humanity. As the war reached its terminal velocity, the atmosphere of the Commonwealth was one of total mobilization, where the various factions poured every ounce of their technological and martial strength into a singular, desperate strike. For the sole survivor, this chapter was the clash of two worlds, the moment where the dirty, battered reality of the surface finally broke into the sterilized, white-walled paradise of the underground. Whether it was by the thundering hand of Liberty Prime ripping the ceiling off the facility, or the surgical strike of a railroad hacking protocol, the invincible fortress was finally breached. This was the era of the internal siege, where the pristine hallways of the Institute became a labyrinth of fire, sparking electronics, and the frantic cries of scientists who had spent their lives believing they were untouchable. The assault was an exercise in technological chaos. In this 11th part of the history, the protagonist led their chosen army through the molecular relay, or the sewer tunnels, emerging into the central atrium amidst a storm of blue laser fire and red-hot ballistic tracers. The Institute's defense was a mechanical wave, as hundreds of synths were pulled from the assembly lines and cast into the meat grinder of the battle, their robotic voices repeating cold, defensive protocols as they were dismantled by power armor or railroad Gauss rifles. The atmosphere was a jarring mix of the clinical and the carnage, where the smell of high-grade plastic and ozone mingled with the copper scent of blood. The sole survivor moved through the chaos with the grim efficiency of a man who had already accepted the death of his old world, their eyes fixed on the elevator that led to the director's quarters, the seat of Father's power, and the location of the reactor that powered the city. The final climb to the reactor room was the ascent of the judge. Every floor of the Institute represented a different facet of the human potential that was being sacrificed for the sake of the mission. They fought through the bioscience gardens, where the synthetic gorillas and experimental flora were shredded by crossfire, and through the advanced systems labs, where the wonders of teleportation were turned into a weapon of mass destruction. This part of the history is defined by the solitude of command, as the protagonist realized that their allies were fighting for a cause, but they were fighting for a closure. When the reactor was finally secured, the task shifted to the most intimate and painful part of the assault: the final confrontation with Sean. The meeting in the director's quarters was the coda of the family. Sean lay in his bed, the terminal illness having finally reclaimed the strength he had used to rule the underground. The atmosphere was one of stifling quietude, a sharp contrast to the roar of the battle raging just outside the doors. This was the moment of the final testament, where the son looked at the parent and offered his last, bitter defense of his life's work. Whether the conversation ended in a cold execution, a tearful farewell, or a mutual acknowledgement of a failed history, the outcome was the same. The Institute's era was over. The protagonist stood over the man who had been the infant in the crib, realizing that in this world there are no clean endings. The parent was now the one saying goodbye to the child, but this time the grave was a city of glass, and the eulogy was a countdown to a nuclear detonation. The 11th part of his history is defined by the exodus of the damned. As the protagonist activated the reactor's self-destruct sequence, they had to lead their remaining forces back to the relay, passing through a world that was literally melting around them. This was the trial of the evacuation, where a choice had to be made regarding the synth child, the robotic replica of Sean, who begged to be taken to the surface. To take the boy was to embrace a digital lie for the sake of a comfort. To leave him was to acknowledge the finality of the truth. The atmosphere was one of pulsing heat. As the reactor reached its critical threshold, the blue light of the facility turning a violent, incandescent red. The 11th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing on the roof of a nearby building in the ruins of Boston, the detonator in their hand. With a single heavy press, the ground shook with a seismic force that could be felt from the glowing sea to the shores of Far Harbor. A pillar of white fire erupted from the center of the city, a second sun that briefly illuminated the skeletons of the skyscrapers before collapsing into a massive, jagged crater. The Institute was gone. The boogeyman of the Commonwealth had been vaporized by its own power, and the subterranean utopia was now a radioactive tomb. The protagonist stood in the falling ash, the blue of their vault suit now scorched and gray, looking out over a world that was finally free, yet profoundly empty. The war was won, the sun was dead, and the Commonwealth was entering a new, uncertain age where the only law was the one written by the survivor's hand. The 12th movement in the saga of the Commonwealth is defined by the first morning, a period of profound and heavy stillness that followed the cataclysmic erasure of the Institute. As the dust and radioactive particulate from the explosion began to settle over the ruins of Boston, the sole survivor stood upon the viewing platform, watching the massive plume of smoke rise like a funeral shroud for a century of scientific hubris. This chapter of the Chronicle marks the transition from the frantic violence of the Great Purge to the daunting, quiet reality of the post-war peace. The atmosphere was one of collective exhaustion, where the various factions, whether the triumphant Brotherhood, the weary Minutemen, or the liberated Railroad, found themselves standing in the wreckage of their victory, realizing that while the enemy was gone, the world they had inherited was still a broken, bleeding shell. The first days of this new era were a story of atmospheric transition. The pervasive, low-level dread that had defined the Commonwealth for generations, the fear of the nightly replacement, had been vaporized along with the molecular relay. For the first time in 60 years, the people of Diamond City and the small settlements of the interior could look at their neighbors without the immediate, stabbing suspicion of a synthetic infiltration. However, this relief was tempered by the economic and social void left by the Institute's destruction. The protagonist, now the undisputed architect of this new reality, had to navigate a landscape where the primary source of technological advance had been removed. This part of the history is a study of the burden of sovereignty, as the hero returned to the surface not as a seeker of a lost child, but as the last authority in a land that had forgotten how to govern itself without the shadow of a hidden master. The atmosphere in the major hubs was a jarring mix of the jubilant and the haunted. In Diamond City, Mayor McDonough's replacement, or the local guards, began to speak of a new foundation. Yet the great green jewel felt smaller now that the myth of the subterranean monster had been debunked. The sole survivor moved through the marketplace, the clank of their armor echoing against the stadium walls, and felt the weight of the gaze. They were no longer the mysterious traveler from the vault. They were the God-slayer, the person who had brought down the sun and buried the future. This 12th part of the history is defined by this isolation of the victor, as the protagonist realized that their personal journey of revenge and recovery had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human evolution. The search for Sean was over, but the memory of the ashen sun remained a cold, persistent ache in the center of their chest. The connection to the synth child, if the protagonist had chosen to rescue the mechanical replica of Sean, became the focal point for a new kind of existential domesticity. In the ruins of Sanctuary Hills, the boy machine lived as a walking ghost of the Saturday morning that had been stolen 2 centuries ago. This was the era of the uncanny piece, where the sole survivor attempted to build a life amidst the rubble, playing the role of a parent to a creature that possessed the face of their child, but the heart of a computer. The atmosphere in the settlement was one of performative normalcy, as the protagonist worked the soil and fortified the walls, trying to drown out the silence of the wasteland with the rhythmic sounds of construction. The Minutemen, now the primary peacekeeping force, began to establish the Commonwealth Provisional Government, a second attempt at the unified council that the Institute had once slaughtered. This period was also the reckoning of the companions. Those who had stood by the protagonist through the fire, Nick Valentine, Piper, Preston, and Hancock, each reacted to the new world in their own way. For Nick, the destruction of his creators was a vague liberation, a moment where the prototype finally became a man without a master, even as he mourned the loss of the data that might have explained his own existence. For Preston, it was the fulfillment of the Minuteman Oath, a hard-won safety for the farmers of the Commonwealth. The 12th movement reveals that the victory was not a singular event, but a multiplex of consequences. The protagonist spent their days traveling from one outpost to another, settling disputes and clearing the remaining pockets of raiders and super mutants who had been emboldened by the chaos of the Institute's fall. The 12th movement of the Chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing on the bridge of Sanctuary Hills, looking out toward the horizon where the Commonwealth was slowly, painfully beginning to rebuild. The air was clear of the yellow fog for a brief moment, and the sun felt warm on their face, a natural, honest heat that didn't come from a reactor or a blast. They had done the impossible. They had survived the past, conquered the present, and cleared the way for a future they would likely never see. The hunt for Sean was a closed chapter, a book of blood and ice that had been shelved forever. As the stars began to appear over the blackened trees, the protagonist realized that the true legend was just beginning. They were the foundation stone of the new world, and the next stretch of the road would lead them toward the distant, misty shores of a new mystery, the island of Far Harbor and the secrets of the fog. The 13th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth marks a departure from the charred remains of Boston and a transition into the mist of the North. As the sole survivor settled into the heavy mantle of leadership, a new frequency crackled across the radio waves, a plea for help from the Nakano family, residing on the lonely, salt-sprayed edge of the Commonwealth's northern coast. This chapter is defined by the search for Kasumi Nakano, a young woman who believed she was a synth and had fled to a distant, mysterious island in search of the truth. The atmosphere shifted from the dry, dusty ruins of the city to the cold, damp, and oppressive air of the great maritime void. To find her, the protagonist had to leave behind the familiar politics of the factions. and take to the sea, sailing a repaired fishing boat through the churning, gray waters of the Atlantic toward the jagged silhouette of Far Harbor. The arrival at the island was a moment of atmospheric immersion. Far Harbor was not simply a new location. It was a character in its own right, a place where the radioactive fog hung like a living shroud over the landscape. This was the era of the strident coast, where the world was colored in shades of deep blue, mossy green, and toxic yellow. The town of Far Harbor itself was a skeletal collection of docks and barricades, inhabited by harbormen, a hardy, suspicious people who lived in a state of permanent siege against the horrors that crawled out of the mist. The protagonist realized immediately that the rules of the Commonwealth did not apply here. The enemies were not just raiders and synths, but the very environment itself. This 13th part of the history is defined by this environmental malice, where every breath of the damp air carried the metallic tang of the fog, and the distant, haunting low of the fog crawlers. Inside the town, the sole survivor met the grizzled leader Captain Avery and the weathered mariner Old Longfellow, characters who represented the endurance of the tide. They spoke of the fog not as a byproduct of the war, but as a sentient force that was slowly reclaiming the island. This led the protagonist into the heart of a three-way Cold War between the harbor folk, the children of Adam, who worshipped the fog as a holy gift, and Acadia, a mountaintop sanctuary for synths who sought to live in peace away from the prying eyes of the Institute or the railroad. The search for Kasumi became a philosophical probe as the protagonist climbed the treacherous, vertical slopes of the island to reach the observatory where the synths made their home. The atmosphere was one of elevated isolation, a place where the high technology of the mind met the primal terror of the mist. In Acadia, the protagonist encountered Daima, an experimental prototype synth who, like Nick Valentine, possessed a memory that stretched back centuries. However, unlike Nick, Daima had survived by curating the past, literally removing his own memories and storing them in external servers to avoid the crushing weight of his own actions. This was the moment of the internal mirror, where the sole survivor was forced to question the nature of identity and the morality of peace. Daima's sanctuary was built on a foundation of necessary secrets, a delicate balance of power maintained through deception. This part of the history is a story of the fragility of coexistence, as the protagonist discovered that to keep the three factions of the island from slaughtering one another, the truth about the fog and the history of the island might have to be buried forever. The 13th movement of the chronicle is also defined by the visions of the atom. To gain the memories stored by Daima, the protagonist had to infiltrate the nucleus, a pre-war submarine base that had become the headquarters for the High Confessor Tectus and his fanatical followers. The atmosphere within the base was one of radiant madness, where the hum of the nuclear reactor was treated as a divine hymn, navigating the digital landscape of Dai Ma's memories was a cybernetic odyssey, a puzzle of light and data that revealed the dark origins of the conflict. The protagonist learned that the peace of the island was a lie, a series of contingency plans involving nuclear launch keys and wind turbine kill switches that could wipe out any of the three factions in a heartbeat. The sole survivor was once again the arbitrator of the abyss, holding the life of an entire ecosystem in their hands. The 13th movement ends with the protagonist standing on the high cliffs of Acadia, looking out as the sun struggled to pierce the thick, radioactive fog. Kasumi Nakano had been found, but the question of her identity and the fate of the island remained a jagged, unresolved wound. The search for a daughter had led to the discovery of a world where memory was a commodity and peace was a weapon. The sole survivor stood between the fanatical fire of the nucleus, the desperate survival of Far Harbor, and the mechanical hope of Acadia. The mist was swirling, the creatures of the deep were rising, and the next step would require a choice that would either wash the island clean in nuclear fire or forge a path through the fog based on a shared, bloody secret. The 14th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the Judgment of the Mist, a period of agonizing moral reckoning where the sole survivor stood as the final arbiter for the three disparate souls of Far Harbor. Having retrieved the fragmented memories of Dai Ma from the digital depths of the nucleus, the protagonist held the literal power of life and death over every living thing on the island. This chapter is defined by the cold logic of survival, as the hero realized that the peace of this fog-shrouded land was not built on the sturdy foundations of the law, but on a series of catastrophic fail-safes. The atmosphere was one of suffocating tension, where the wind-whipped rain and the yellow radiation of the fog felt like a physical manifestation of the secrets that threatened to boil over into a war of total extinction. The sole survivor was no longer just a traveler. They were the warden of the island, tasked with deciding if a lie told in the name of peace was more valuable than a truth that would end in fire. In this 14th part of the history, the protagonist confronted Dai Ma with the evidence of his past sins, specifically the murder of the original Captain Avery and her replacement with a synthetic double. The atmosphere within the observatory of Acadia was one of ethical vertigo. Dai Ma, the machine who had sought to be better than his creators, had committed the ultimate human crime to ensure the safety of his people. This was the era of the internal trial, where the sole survivor had to weigh the synthetic's desire for a peaceful coexistence against the harbor folks' right to justice. If the truth were revealed to the people of Far Harbor, the mob would march on Acadia, and the sanctuary of the synths would be burned to the ground. The protagonist stood in the dim light of the memory servers, realizing that the purity of the hero was a luxury that the island could not afford. To save everyone, they might have to become an accomplice to a murder that had happened decades ago. The struggle then shifted toward the nucleus and the volatile children of Adam. The memories had revealed the location of a nuclear launch key, a device that could detonate the ancient submarine's warheads and grant the cult their great division, the ultimate radioactive embrace of their god. This part of the history is a story of the fanatic's choice, where the protagonist had to decide if the cult was a cancer to be excised or a group of lost souls to be managed. The atmosphere within the submarine base was a fever dream of clicking Geiger counters and the rhythmic, hypnotic chanting of High Confessor Tectus. The sole survivor had the power to lead the cult to a peaceful replacement of their leader, with a synth double mimicking Daima's original sin, or to simply turn the key and vaporize the mountain. This was the weight of the atom, a realization that in the wasteland, sometimes the only way to prevent a war is to orchestrate a quiet, controlled tragedy. The 14th part of his history is defined by this triage of souls. If the protagonist chose the path of the great peacemaker, they participated in a complex web of deceptions, replacing the hostile Tectus with a synthetic puppet and burying the truth of Avery's murder. The atmosphere of the island shifted to one of quiet, managed despair. The fog still hung heavy, and the creatures still prowled the coast, but the three factions settled into a rhythmic, if dishonest, truce. This was the victory of the shadow, where the hero acknowledged that the Commonwealth's idealistic goals of freedom and justice were too heavy for the thin soil of Far Harbor. They saved the town, the cult, and the synths, but they did so by sacrificing their own moral clarity, becoming a shadow governor of a land built on ghosts and code. Alternatively, for those who chose the cleansing storm, the 14th movement became a story of elemental purge. The protagonist could choose to disable the wind turbines that held back the fog, allowing the radioactive mist to reclaim the town of Far Harbor, or they could trigger the launch of the missiles. The atmosphere of these endings was one of nihilistic finality, where the jagged rocks of the island were washed clean of human life, leaving only the fog and the monsters behind. The sole survivor walked the empty docks of the harbor or the smoking craters of the mountain, realizing that they had brought the same fire that had destroyed Boston to the edge of the world. This was the end of the maritime myth, a grim reminder that some conflicts are so deep-seated that only the erasure of the participants can bring a true, silent peace. The 14th movement of the chronicle ends with the resolution of Kasumi Nakano's fate. Having seen the inner workings of Acadia and the potential for both great good and great evil within the synthetic mind, the young woman looked to the protagonist for guidance. This was the final human note, a quiet conversation amidst the ruins of a larger world. Whether she returned to her family on the coast or stayed to find a new life in the mist, the mission that had brought the sole survivor to the island was concluded. The 14th part ended as the protagonist boarded the fishing boat once more, the engine's cough echoing over the water as they steered away from the jagged cliffs. They left behind a land that was changed forever, carrying the weight of the island's secret back to the Commonwealth. The fog was receding into the wake of the boat, but the shadows of the choices made would follow the survivor all the way back to the ruins of the City of Diamonds. The 15th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth marks the ascent of the overboss, a jarring transition from the somber, fog-drenched morality of the North to the garish, neon-saturated anarchy of the West. After the heavy silence of Far Harbor, the sole survivor was drawn by a flickering radio signal to the Nuka World Transit Center, where a pre-war monorail waited to carry passengers to America's favorite vacation destination. This chapter is defined by the discovery of a world where the pre-war obsession with consumerism had curdled into a brutal, raider-led feudalism. The atmosphere shifted from the gray and green of the coast to the bright, artificial colors of a decaying amusement park, where the smell of sugar and grease mingled with the scent of gunpowder and old blood. To enter Nuka World was to step into the gauntlet, a lethal, televised obstacle course designed to weed out the weak and provide entertainment for the 3 raider gangs who held the park in a state of precarious, violent balance. The survival of the gauntlet was a moment of primal exhibitionism. Moving through trapped corridors filled with radioactive spray and electrified floors, the protagonist was mocked by the voice of Coulter, the current overboss, over the park's intercom. The climax of this trial was a battle in the Kolakars arena, where the sole survivor had to use a squirt gun filled with electrolyte fluid to short out the overboss's electrified power armor before finishing him with cold steel. This was the involuntary coronation, where the man out of time, who had led the Minutemen and destroyed the Institute, was suddenly declared the leader of the very monsters he had spent a year hunting. The atmosphere of the park was one of vituperative celebration, as the 3 gangs, the disciplined, profit-driven disciples, the wild, animalistic pack, and the refined, aristocratic operators, looked to their new leader to expand their territory and break the long-standing stalemate of the park. In this 15th part of the history, the protagonist met Porter Gage, a cynical, strategic raider who acted as the shadow behind the throne. Gage explained the economy of the parks, a reality where the various themed zones of Nuka World had been overrun by creatures and anomalies even the Commonwealth had never seen. The search for a son was now replaced by the Grand Tour, a campaign to reclaim the 5 outlying parks and assign them to the different gangs. The atmosphere of these zones was a kaleidoscope of thematic horrors. In Safari Adventure, the protagonist faced the gator claws, predatory hybrids created by a malfunctioning cloning machine. In Galactic Zone, the park's defensive robots had turned their pre-war protocols into a lethal, orbital bombardment of the grounds. Each park was a microcosm of the failed paradise, a reminder that the pre-war world's pursuit of entertainment was built on a foundation of dangerous, unchecked technology. The exploration of Dry Rock Gulch and the Kitty Kingdom added layers of gilded decay to the journey. In the Western-themed Gulch, the protagonist had to outwit bloodworms and robotic sheriffs, while in the kingdom, they navigated a toxic, pink mist labyrinth maintained by Oswald the Outrageous, a sentient, glowing ghoul who still believed his people could be cured of their radiation. This was the era of the moral erosion, where the sole survivor had to decide if they were playing a role to keep the raiders at bay, or if they were truly becoming the monster of the parks. The atmosphere was one of performative cruelty, as the hero was forced to settle disputes between the gangs, knowing that favoring one would inevitably lead to the betrayal of another. The legend of the hero was being tested by the lure of the crown, the seductive idea that in a world of chaos, it is better to be the one holding the leash. The 15th part of his history is also defined by the bottling of the past. Inside the world of refreshment, the protagonist discovered the secret history of Nuka-Cola Quantum, a beverage developed in conjunction with the military to serve as a delivery system for weaponized isotopes. This was the capitalist revelation, where the bright blue glow of the soda became a symbol for the same atomic hubris that had ended the world. The sole survivor realized that Nuka World was not just a park. It was a monument to consumption, a place where the human desire for more had led directly to the mushroom clouds. By securing the parks, the protagonist was not just building an empire. They were inheriting the sins of the corporations that had paved the road to the Great War. The 15th movement of the chronicle ends with the completion of the Grand Tour and the activation of the Nuka Power Plant. As the lights of the park flickered to life for the first time in 2 centuries, illuminating the skyline with a blinding, multicolored brilliance, the sole survivor stood atop the mountain, looking down at the kingdom they had claimed. But the victory came with a demonic invitation to truly rule as overboss. The raider gangs now demanded that the protagonist lead them back to the Commonwealth to establish raider outposts, turning the very settlements they had built into vassal states. The 15th part ended with the protagonist looking toward the distant horizon of Boston, realizing that the final battle for the Commonwealth's soul was not against the Institute, but against the despot within. The hero of the vault was at a crossroads: to remain the protector of the common people, or to descend into the neon-lit madness of a warlord. The 16th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is defined by the Great Schism of the Soul, a period of intense moral confrontation where the sole survivor was forced to choose between the legacy they had built in the mud of sanctuary and the iron-fisted empire they had inherited under the neon of Nuka World. Following the restoration of power to the parks, the 3 raider gangs, the disciples, the operators, and the pack turned their predatory gaze eastward toward the thriving settlements of the Commonwealth. This chapter is defined by the violation of the home, as Porter Gage pushed for the establishment of raider outposts on the heroes. own turf. The atmosphere was one of betrayal in the air, a thick, suffocating tension that hung over the Commonwealth as the blue-clad savior of the vault returned not with a helping hand, but with a vanguard of thugs and killers. The first step into this campaign of subjugation was the most painful. To establish a foothold, the protagonist had to target a settlement they had likely personally fortified, forcing the settlers to either leave their land or pay tribute in food and scrap. This was the era of the despot's shadow, where the sole survivor's reputation as the hero of Concord began to crumble under the weight of their new title as overboss. The atmosphere in the settlements shifted from hopeful industry to cowering compliance. Watching the Minutemen, who had once looked to the protagonist as a beacon of hope, now gripped their muskets in confusion, and fear was a spiritual erosion. Preston Garvey, the man who had first called the protagonist general, provided the ultimate moral anchor. His disappointment was a cold, sharp blade, a declaration that the bond of trust was severed. The protagonist realized that you cannot build a kingdom on the bodies of those you swore to protect without losing the very thing you were protecting. Inside the raider outposts, the atmosphere was one of decadent anarchy. The colorful, chaotic aesthetic of Nuka World began to bleed into the gray Commonwealth, with spiked barricades, neon signs, and pick-me-up stations, replacing the communal gardens and water purifiers of the Minutemen. This part of the history is a story of the three-way tension, as the protagonist had to manage the explosive rivalries between the gangs. The disciples demanded blood and terror. The operators demanded caps and efficiency. And the pack demanded a hierarchy of raw strength. To favor, one was to invite a knife in the back from the others. This led to the turn at the power plant, where the gang left out of the expansion finally snapped, staging a bloody coup that forced the sole survivor to participate in a fratricidal purge. The air atop the power plant was thick with the smell of ozone and the screams of the betrayed, a reminder that a crown of thorns is still a crown. The 16th part of his history is also defined by the potential for the open season. For many versions of the legend, this was the moment of the great cleansing, where the sole survivor, sickened by the cruelty of the raiders and the grief of the settlers, decided to tear the entire structure down. This was the redemption through fire, a singular, suicidal assault on the Nuka World Market and the gang headquarters. The atmosphere was one of unrelenting close-quarters slaughter, as the protagonist turned their weapons on the very people who had called them overboss. The bright colors of the park were stained with the reality of a massacre, and the gauntlet was run once more, but this time in reverse. By choosing to execute the raider leaders, the hero sought to cauterize the wound they had inflicted on the Commonwealth, trading an empire of caps for the quiet, difficult path of the protector once more. This period was the reclaiming of the general's hat. If the protagonist chose to wipe out the raiders, the 16th movement reveals the weight of forgiveness. Returning to Sanctuary Hills to face Preston Garvey and the survivors was an exercise in humility and penance. The scars on the land remained. The raider outposts had to be dismantled. The settlers had to be convinced of their safety, and the blood money of the parks had to be redistributed. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth became one of wary reconstruction, as the hero realized that trust, once broken, is much harder to rebuild than a stone wall. They were no longer the incorruptible savior, but a man of flaws who had glimpsed the darkness of the wastes and barely clawed their way back to the light. The 16th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing at the edge of the Commonwealth, looking back at the road to Nuka World. The raider threat was either managed or extinguished, but the innocence of the early days was gone forever. The age of the overboss had taught the protagonist that the true enemy was not the Institute or the death claws, but the capacity for cruelty that lives in the heart of every survivor. As the sun set, casting a long red glow over the ruins of the city, the protagonist felt the solitude of the long road. They had conquered the parks and the sea, but the wasteland was vast, and the next movement would take them into the Vault-Tec workshop. A journey into the mechanical madness of the Earth's crust to see if they could build a better world from the inside out. The 17th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the subterranean blueprint, a departure from the open skis of the surface into the lightless limestone depths of the earth. Following the turmoil of the Raider Wars, a faint, automated distress signal led the sole survivor to a collapsed quarry on the outskirts of the Commonwealth. Behind a massive, unyielding gear door lay Vault 88, a site that had remained unfinished since the bombs fell in 2077. This chapter is defined by the encounter with Overseer Barstow, a woman who had spent 2 centuries as a ghoul, trapped in the darkness and clinging to the cold, scientific mandates of Vault-Tec. The atmosphere shifted from the chaotic survivalism of the wastes to the sterile ambition of the pre-war era, as the protagonist was invited to step into the role of a master builder and a social engineer. Inside the cavernous expanse of Vault 88, the mission was one of excavation and enlightenment. The protagonist had to clear out the limestone blockages and the nests of radioactive creatures to reveal a space large enough to house a small city. This was the era of the internal frontier, where the sole survivor used the resources of the surface to construct a sprawling, modular sanctuary beneath the bedrock. The atmosphere was one of industrial isolation, the rhythmic clanging of hammers and the hum of massive generators echoing through the hollowed-out earth. For the first time, the hero was not just defending a settlement, but designing the very parameters of human life, choosing the layout of the living quarters, the strength of the security forces, and the efficiency of the life support systems. The 17th part of this history is defined by the ethics of the experiment. Overseer Barstow, still loyal to the original, cruel directives of Vault-Tec, presented the protagonist with a series of prototypes, devices designed to to maximize the productivity and happiness of the dwellers through questionable means, from soda machines that dispensed performance-enhancing chemicals to slot machines that harvested data on human greed. The sole survivor was forced to decide between efficiency and empathy. This was the weight of the overseer's desk, a realization that the power to build a society comes with the temptation to control it. The atmosphere was a tense dialogue between the protagonist's post-war morality and the overseer's pre-war clinical detachment, a reflection of the same struggle that had birthed the Institute. This period was also the unification of the depths. As the vault expanded, the protagonist discovered that the caverns of Vault 88 connected to various points across the Commonwealth, from the University Point Pharmacy to the Milton General Hospital. This created a shadow network, a way to move resources and people beneath the prying eyes of the surface factions. The 17th movement reveals the strategic depth of the hero's leadership. They were no longer just a figurehead on the surface, but the master of a hidden fortress that could serve as a final fallback point for the people of the Commonwealth. The atmosphere of the vault became one of quiet prosperity, where the blue and yellow jumpsuits of the dwellers stood out against the gray rock, a visual promise that the civilization of the past could be reclaimed and improved upon. 17th movement of the chronicle ends with the completion of the vault's primary structures and the final resolution of Overseer Barstow's fate. Whether the protagonist chose to follow her experiments to their logical, cold conclusion, or steered the vault toward a more humane existence, the result was a bastion of the earth. As the protagonist stood on the high catwalk of the central atrium, looking down at the bustling life they had created in the dark, they felt a sense of geological security. The surface was still a place of radiation and raiders, but here, protected by miles of stone and a massive steel door, the dream of 2077 was finally being realized on the survivors' terms. The 17th part ended with the protagonist sealing the door behind them as they headed back to the surface, the light of the Vault 88 sign fading into the darkness, a hidden heart beating in the center of the wasteland. The 18th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is defined by the mechanical uprising, a period of sudden, metallic violence that shattered the relative peace of the surface roads. While the protagonist was busy rebuilding the foundations of society, a new threat emerged from the shadows. Swarms of customized, lethal robots began roaming the wastes, slaughtering caravans and settlers with a cold, programmed efficiency. This chapter is characterized by the symphony of scrap, as the sole survivor encountered Ada, a highly modified assaultron who had lost her entire caravan to these marauding machines. The atmosphere shifted to one of industrial paranoia, where the sound of whirring servos and the glow of red optic sensors in the night became the new heralds of death. To stop the slaughter, the hero had to become a technological scavenger, hunting down these robotic squads to harvest their parts and uncover the frequency of their mysterious master, the Mechanist. In this 18th part of the history, the protagonist transformed their settlements into automated foundries. Using the new robot workbench, the sole survivor began to build their own mechanical army, mixing and matching limbs, weapons, and sensors from fallen enemies to create the ultimate protectors. This was the era of the sentient tool, where the line between machine and companion blurred. Ada, with her grief-stricken but loyal personality, acted as the guide into the logic of the circuitry. The atmosphere was one of scientific macabre, as the hero experimented with unstable explosives, hydraulic claws, and thick Tesla plating. The Commonwealth watched as a new kind of war was waged, not of flesh and bone, but of sparking wires and heavy steel, a battle for the dominance of the signal that pulsed through the airwaves. The hunt led the protagonist to the Robco Sales and Service Center, a pre-war facility that hid a massive, sprawling manufacturing plant beneath its mundane exterior. The descent into the facility was a journey through the ghost of the machine, where the walls were lined with the skeletal remains of thousands of unbuilt robots. This was the fortress of the Iron Mind, guarded by waves of robobrains creatures that utilized organic human brains as biological processors. The atmosphere was one of Gothic futurism, where the hum of the assembly lines sounded like a digital heartbeat. The sole survivor realized that the Mechanist was not just building soldiers. They were mass-producing a malfunctioning justice, attempting to save the Commonwealth by eliminating anything their flawed logic perceived as a threat. The final confrontation with the Mechanist was a theatrical overload. In a grand chamber filled with Tesla coils and massive screens, the protagonist fought through a gauntlet of the Mechanist's finest creations, the dual bots and the sentry models, while the villain, clad in a silver and black suit of retro-futuristic armor, delivered a manifesto of misguided heroism. When the masks were finally removed, the monster was revealed to be Isabel Cruz, a lonely, brilliant woman who truly believed she was doing good. This was the tragedy of the good intent, where the protagonist had to decide whether to execute the woman for her catastrophic errors or to spare her and use her genius to fix the mess she had made. The atmosphere shifted from a battleground to a confessional, a reminder that in the wasteland, the road to hell is often paved with the best blueprints. The 18th part of this history is defined by the integration of the iron. If spared, Isabel provided the hero with the means to turn the robot swarms into a force for infrastructure and defense. The Commonwealth began to see mechanical caravans moving between settlements, tireless protectors who never slept and never felt fear. This was the automation of the peace, where the sole survivor used the technology that had almost destroyed them to cement their control over the land. The atmosphere of the wastes became more structured, the robotic sentinels providing a sense of order that the Minutemen alone could never achieve. The protagonist stood at the center of a new digital web, their hand on the pulse of every circuit in the territory. The 18th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing in the mechanist's control room, looking out at the monitors that displayed a Commonwealth now guarded by steel. The threat of the mechanical menace had been neutralized, turned into a tool for the reconstruction of the world. The hero had mastered the Earth in Vault 88 and the machines in the Robco plant. They were becoming something more than a leader. They were becoming a governor of systems. As the red lights of the facility hummed with a new, peaceful energy, the protagonist prepared to return to the surface. The next movement would take them back to the human element as they faced the Vault-Tec representative and the ghouls of the past, reconciling the immortality of the radioactive with the mortality of their own mission. The 19th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is a study of the eternal witness, a transition from the cold metal of the machines to the lingering, radioactive humanity of the ghouls. Having mastered the technology of the surface and the depths, the sole survivor turned their attention back to the people who had survived the 2 centuries since the Great War through the cruel mercy of radiation. This chapter is defined by the reunion with the Vault-Tec representative, the very man who had stood at the gates of Sanctuary Hills on that fateful Saturday morning. Finding him in the cramped, rotting rooms of the Hotel Rixford in Goodneighbor was a moment of recursive history. The atmosphere was one of stagnant regret, as the protagonist looked upon the scarred, yellowed skin of a man who had been promised a spot in the vault, only to be left behind to rot while the world burned. In this 19th part of the history, the protagonist brought the representative back to Sanctuary Hills, completing a loop of 200 years. This was the era of the living relics, where the settlements of the Commonwealth began to house those who remembered the world before the fire. The atmosphere was one of melancholy nostalgia, as the ghouls shared stories of green grass and blue skies with settlers who had known only the gray dust of the wastes. The sole survivor realized that the ghouls were the memory banks of humanity, the only bridge left to the era they had lost. This led to a deeper investigation into the Slockham's Joe corporate ruins and the forgotten bunkers where the last vestiges of the pre-war bureaucracy still lingered in a state of necrotic decay. Their paperwork and protocols, now nothing more than fuel for the wasteland's fires. The journey then moved toward the crater of Adam, deep within the glowing sea, to explore the spiritual evolution of the irradiated. This part of the history is a story of radiant apotheosis, where the protagonist sought to understand why some were driven to madness by the glow, while others found a terrifying peace. The atmosphere was one of religious static, the crackle of the Geiger counter serving as a background hymn for the children of Adam. The sole survivor encountered Mother Isolde, a woman who lived in the very heart of the impact zone, treating the lethal radiation as a holy mother that would eventually lead her people to a new plane of existence. This was the weight of the unseen, where the hero had to decide if these cultists were a threat to be neutralized, or or a unique, tragic evolution of the human spirit that deserved to be left alone in their golden hell. This period was also marked by the tragedy of the feral. In the ruins of the Croup Manor and the Suffolk County Charter School, the protagonist witnessed the final, inevitable fate of those ghouls whose minds finally succumbed to the rot. This was the death of the ego, where the memories of a life lived were replaced by a primal, screeching hunger. The atmosphere was one of horrific familiarity, as the hero fought through rooms filled with creatures wearing the tattered remains of pre-war clothing doctors, teachers, and children who had simply lived too long. The 19th movement reveals the mercy of the bullet, where the sole survivor acted as a grim reaper, releasing these echoes of the past from their eternal, mindless cycle of pain. The 19th movement of the chronicle is defined by this reconciliation with time. The protagonist realized that immortality in the Commonwealth was a curse disguised as a miracle. Whether it was the Vault-Tec representative finding a new purpose as a trader, or the children of Adam waiting for their great division, the survivors of the Great War were all just grains of sand in a shifting desert. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth became more somber, a realization that the new world was being built on the bones of a yesterday that refused to stay buried. The hero stood as the bridge between the two, a man out of time leading a people who were running out of it. The 19th movement ends with the sole survivor standing in the cemetery of Sanctuary Hills, looking at the empty graves they had dug for a family that never made it out. The representative was nearby, tending to a shop, his raspy voice a constant reminder of the day the world ended. The eternity of the ghoul had taught the protagonist that to live forever is to lose everything eventually. As the moon rose over the river, casting a silver light on the rusted bridge, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift from the past to the fringe of the map as they prepared to deal with the gunner consummation, the final confrontation with the mercenary army that sought to turn the Commonwealth into a private military state. The 20th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the shattering of the mercenary star, a brutal, large-scale military campaign to dismantle the gunner hegemony. For too long, the gunners, a cold, highly organized paramilitary force, had occupied the strategic high ground of the South, turning pre-war landmarks into fortresses of extortion and death. This chapter is defined by the return to Quincy, the site of the Minutemen's original betrayal, and the massacre that had sent Preston Garvey fleeing to Concord. The atmosphere was one of vengeful reclamation, as the sole survivor led a coalition of their chosen forces back to the elevated ruins of the town. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and the heavy thrum of vertibird rotors, a sign that the disorganized survivors of the past had finally become a disciplined army capable of taking back their history. In this 20th part of the history, The battle for Quincy was an exercise in vertical warfare. The gunners had fortified the elevated highways that loomed over the town, using long-range snipers and heavy missile launchers to control the approach. The atmosphere was a chaotic symphony of high-caliber attrition, where the protagonist had to lead a breach of the barricades under a constant rain of fire. This was the era of the general's justice, where the traitors who had turned their backs on the people, men like Clint and the ruthless Commander Tessa, were finally brought to account. Each floor of the ruined buildings was a bloody struggle for inches, a reminder that while the Institute fought with shadows, the gunners fought with the crushing weight of military hardware and a total lack of empathy. The campaign then turned toward the GNN headquarters, the massive broadcasting building that served as the brain of the gunner operation. This part of the history is a story of the Siege of the Signal, where the protagonist had to decapitate the leadership of the mercenary army. The atmosphere inside the headquarters was one of totalitarian utility, the walls lined with tactical maps and lists of settlements marked for taxation. The sole survivor realized that the gunners were not just raiders in better gear. They were a failed state, a military machine that had forgotten it needed a civilian heart to beat. The final confrontation with Captain Wheeze in the executive offices was the severing of the command, a cold execution that sent a message across every radio frequency in the Commonwealth. The era of the mercenary was over, and the era of the citizen had returned. This period was also marked by the scouring of the outposts. From the Hallucinogen Inc. building to Vault 95, the protagonist tracked down the remaining gunner cells, discovering the dark experiments and chemical stockpiles that fueled their aggression. This was the sanitization of the South, a systematic clearing of the map that allowed the trade routes to finally breathe. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth shifted from a collection of isolated islands of safety to a unified territory where the blue and gold of the Minutemen or the steel of the Brotherhood stood guard over every major junction. The 20th movement reveals the maturation of the leader as the hero transitioned from a survivor seeking a child to a statesman securing a border. The 20th part of this history is defined by the silence of the guns. As the last of the gunner strongholds fell, the survivors among the mercenaries were either absorbed into the local militias or driven back into the swamps of the South. The protagonist stood on the roof of the GNN building, looking out over a landscape that was finally, truly under their control. The atmosphere was one of hard-won stability, a quiet satisfaction that came with the knowledge that a mother or father could walk from sanctuary to the castle without fear of an ambush. The gunner consummation had provided the Commonwealth with its first real taste of a permanent peace, a foundation upon which a new nation could finally be built. The 20th movement of the Chronicle ends with the sole survivor placing a memorial at the site of the Quincy massacre, a simple gesture of remembrance and closure. The debts of the past had been paid in full, and the threats of the present were fading into the trees. But the wasteland is never truly empty, and as the wind picked up from the coast, a new call for help began to filter through the static. The next movement would take the protagonist into the Covenant paradox, a journey into a pristine, white picket fence community that hid a secret more disturbing than any raider gang. The search for justice was shifting from the battlefield to the examination of the soul, as the hero faced the question of how far one should go to protect a perfect world. The 21st movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the trial of the white picket fence, a descent into the unsettling perfection of Covenant. After the thunderous military campaigns against the gunners, the sole survivor followed a trail of a missing caravan to a small, walled community that seemed like a hallucination of the pre-war era. This chapter is defined by the paradox of security, as the protagonist entered a town of pristine gardens, freshly painted houses, and polite, smiling residents who lived as if the Great War had never happened. The atmosphere was one of stifling serenity, where the sound of wind chimes and the smell of lemonade masked a deep, vibrating paranoia. To enter, the hero had to pass the safe test, a series of psychological questions that felt more like a ritual than an entrance exam, designed to weed out those who did not belong in this manufactured Eden. This 21st part of the history, the search for the missing caravan led the protagonist behind the masks of the cheerful inhabitants. This was the era of the domestic detective, where the sole survivor had to snoop through locked drawers and decrypted terminals, while the town's leader, Swanson, watched with a friendly, unblinking gaze. The atmosphere was one of quiet intrusion, as the hero realized that the perfect order of Covenant was a thin veil for a deeper obsession with the Institute's synths. The discovery of a hidden note led the protagonist across the lake to a secret laboratory known as the Compound, a damp, concrete bunker where the true purpose of the safe test was revealed. This was the science of the scar, a place where scientists conducted brutal, fatal experiments on suspected synths to find a foolproof way to detect them. The journey through the Compound was a story of the ethics of fear. The protagonist encountered Dr. Rosalind Chambers, the head of the research, who viewed her victims not as people, but as invasive variables. The atmosphere within the bunker was one of clinical cruelty, the sterile white tiles of the lab rooms stained with the reality of her work. The sole survivor found the missing caravan member, Amelia Stockton, locked in a cell, awaiting the final phase of the test. The weight of the dilemma was thrust upon the hero. To save a girl who might be a synth, but was undeniably a person, or to support a research project that, while monstrous, claimed to be the only defense the human race had against the Institute's infiltration. This was the moral gray of the wastes, where the hero had to decide if the survival of humanity justified the loss of its soul. The 21st part of this history is defined by the shattering of the ideal. If the protagonist chose to rescue Amelia, they were forced to slaughter the guards and scientists of the compound, eventually returning to Covenant to find the town's serene mask replaced by a violent fury. The resulting battle was a tragic clearing of the streets, as the hero had to put down the very people they had initially admired for their resilience. The atmosphere of the town shifted from a pre-war dream to a post-war tomb. The blood on the white fences a testament to the fact that perfection in the Commonwealth is always bought with a terrible price. The 21st movement reveals that the greatest threat to community isn't always the monster outside the walls, but the obsession within the heart. This period was the reclaiming of the soil. With the original inhabitants gone, or the secret of the compound secured, Covenant became a vassal of the truth. The protagonist took control of the town, turning it into a true sanctuary that no longer required a blood sacrifice to maintain its peace. The atmosphere became one of genuine integration, as synths and humans lived side by side without the shadow of the safe test hanging over them. The 19th movement shows the sole survivor acting as the purge of the paranoia, proving that a community can be safe without being a prison. They replaced the forced smiles with the honest, tired faces of refugees who finally had a place to call home. The 21st movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor sitting on the porch of one of the Covenant houses, watching the sun set over the lake. The trial of the white picket fence had taught them that the trauma of the Institute's reach was more than just physical. It was a psychological wound that would take generations to heal. The search for justice had led to the destruction of a dream, but it had saved a life. As the lights of the town flickered on, illuminating the gardens in a soft, peaceful glow, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the secrets of the high-rise as they investigated the hallucinogen labs and the Vault-Tec Regional HQ to see what other pre-war horrors were still waiting to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting world. The 22nd movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is a descent into the chemical labyrinth, a journey through the corporate ruins of Hallucinogen, Inc. Located in the heart of the Boston ruins, this pre-war facility stood as a monument to a specialized kind of cruelty, the development of non-lethal, mind-altering weaponry for crowd control and psychological warfare. This chapter is defined by the aerosol madness, as the sole survivor entered a building where the ventilation system had long ago failed, leaking experimental gas into every corridor. The atmosphere was one of vivid insanity, where the laws of physics and the reliability of the senses were replaced by a neon-soaked fever dream. To enter Hallucinogen was to witness the erosion of the self, as the protagonist encountered gunners who had been driven to a state of permanent homicidal psychosis by the very chemicals their faction had hoped to salvage. In this 22nd part of the history, the mission was one of forensic extraction. The protagonist was tasked with retrieving a specialized research canister for the chemist Fred Allen in Goodneighbor. But the physical goal was secondary to the psychological gauntlet of the facility. This was the era of the unreliable narrator, where the walls seemed to pulse with an artificial light, and the screams of the maddened echoed through the pipes. The atmosphere was one of corporate malevolence, as the sole survivor bypassed laboratory chambers where pre-war test subjects had been subjected to the hallucinogen protocols, experiments involving sensory deprivation, forced aggression, and the total shattering of the human ego. The hero moved through the green and purple haze of the gas, their gas mask or power armor providing the only thin barrier between sanity and the collective delirium of the building. The exploration of the lower levels was a story of the lab of lost souls. The protagonist found terminals detailing the company's pride in creating a product that could make a mother forget her child or a soldier turn on his squad. This was the weight of the sinister patent, where the high technology of the pre-war era was revealed to be a tool for the absolute degradation of the human spirit. The atmosphere within the research wing was a tableau of chaos, with broken glass and scorched consoles reflecting the final moments of the scientists who had been consumed by their own creations. The sole survivor realized that the Great War had not just been fought with nuclear missiles, but with 1,000 small domestic atrocities like the ones developed in these halls. This period was also marked by the Battle of the Blurred Lines. Fighting the crazed gunners was different from any other combat in the wastes. They moved with a frantic, unpredictable energy, their eyes dilated, and their voices screaming at hallucinations only they could see. This was the symphony of the synapse, where the protagonist had to rely on raw instinct to survive the close quarters ambushes in the fog. The 22nd movement reveals the fragility of the mind, as the hero witnessed how easily a trained military unit could be reduced to a pack of snarling animals by a few milligrams of an airborne toxin. By reaching the core of the facility and shutting down the gas release, the sole survivor acted as a chemical exorcist, bringing a cold, silent clarity back to the ruins of the office block. The 22nd part of this history is defined by the tainted prize. Emerging from hallucinogen with the research canister, the protagonist felt the lingering static of the experience, a reminder that the ghosts of the old world are not always spirits, but sometimes just persistent, poisonous ideas. The atmosphere of the Commonwealth outside felt strangely sharp and real after the distorted corridors of the lab. This was the era of the scientific reckoning, where the hero delivered the chemicals to the surface, knowing they were placing a dangerous power into the hands of the survivors. The 22nd movement shows the protagonist as the carrier of the forbidden, a man who had looked into the darkest corners of the corporate past and carried its secrets back into the light of the present. The 22nd movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing on the fire escape of the hallucinogen building, looking down at the rusted cars and the piles of trash that lined the street. The chemical labyrinth had taught them that the most dangerous weapon in the wasteland was not the mini-nuke, but the loss of one's own mind. They had survived the madness, but the echoes of the green gas would remain in their memories. As they prepared for the next movement, the focus would shift to the secrets of the regional HQ, where the Vault-Tec conspiracy would be further unraveled. The hero headed toward the north, the weight of the canister in their pack, a heavy reminder that in the Commonwealth, even the air you breathe can be a betrayal. The 23rd movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the unmasking of the architect, a journey into the Vault-Tec Regional HQ located in the heart of downtown Boston. After surviving the chemical haze of hallucinogen, the sole survivor sought the source of the grand design that had frozen their life in a block of ice for 200 years. This chapter is defined by the bureaucracy of the apocalypse, as the protagonist entered a building where the end of the world had been treated as a series of spreadsheets, quotas, and logistical hurdles. The atmosphere shifted from the chaotic survival of the streets to the dusty professionalism of a corporate office that had been waiting for a meeting that would never happen. To explore these halls was to witness the banality of evil, realizing that the suffering of the vault dwellers was not a byproduct of the war, but a carefully curated product of a boardroom. In this 23rd part of the history, the mission was one of administrative archaeology. The protagonist navigated through collapsed cubicles and rusted filing cabinets to reach the central mainframe. This was the era of the paperwork of doom, where the hero discovered the master experiment list, a chilling catalog of every vault in the Commonwealth and the specific psychological or physical torment assigned to each. The atmosphere was one of quiet revulsion, as the sole survivor read terminals detailing how Vault 95 was designed to destroy recovering addicts, and how Vault 81 was intended to be a human petri dish for every known disease. The hero realized that Vault-Tec was not a savior of humanity, but a predatory observer, treating the survivors of a nuclear holocaust as laboratory rats in a cage of concrete and steel. The exploration of the basement levels was a story of the corporate bunker. The protagonist fought through security robots that were still programmed to protect trade secrets more than human lives. This was the weight of the hidden agenda, where the records revealed that the Vault-Tec executives knew the bombs were coming and viewed the destruction as the ultimate opportunity for data collection. The atmosphere within the executive suites was a museum of arrogance, with luxury furniture and fine pre-war alcohol preserved in a tomb of self-importance. The sole survivor found that the Project Safe House was a misnomer. It was actually a Project Harvest, a way to see how humans would react under the most extreme stresses imaginable to prepare for a future that the executives intended to rule. This period was also marked by the reckoning of the personal. Among the files, the protagonist found the specific cryogenic log for Vault 111. Reading the cold, clinical observations of their own freezing and the subsequent high-priority retrieval of Sean was the final insult of the old world. This was the documentation of the abduction, proving that Vault Tech had facilitated the Institute's entry into the vault. The 23rd movement reveals the interconnectedness of the nightmare, showing that the pre-war corporations and the post-war monsters were two sides of the same rusted coin. The hero stood in the flickering light of the terminal, realizing that their entire life, from the morning in Sanctuary to the battle for the Institute, had been a variable in a long-term study. The 23rd part of this history is defined by the download of the truth. As the protagonist extracted the master data and prepared to leave, the atmosphere of the building felt like an empty shell. The secrets were out, but the people they protected were long dead. This was the era of the informed sovereign, where the hero carried the full weight of Vault Tech's treachery back to the surface. The 23rd movement shows the protagonist as the historian of the damned, a man who now understood that the new world was not just a result of nuclear fire, but of a deliberate, calculated betrayal by the very people who claimed to be the guardians of the future. The 23rd movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing on the steps of the regional HQ, looking out at the skyline of Boston. The unmasking of the architect had stripped away the last of the pre-war illusions. They had the names, the dates, and the data of a century of experiments. As the wind whistled through the broken windows of the skyscraper, the protagonist felt a cold, analytical fury. The focus would now shift to the coastal shadows as they headed toward the wreck of the FMS Northern Star to confront the lost raiders and the lingering ghosts of the sea. The hero was no longer just a survivor. They were the executor of a failed legacy, ready to ensure that the secrets of the past would never be used to chain the future again. The 24th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the Lament of the Marooned, a journey to the desolate, salt-crusted southern coast to investigate the massive, tilting, rusted hull of the FMS Northern Star. After uncovering the high-tech conspiracies of Vault Tech, the sole survivor found themselves drawn to a more primal, tragic story, one written in the language of a forgotten tongue and the creaking of old iron. This chapter is defined by the discovery of a crew of Norwegian sailors who had been ghoulified and stranded on the deck of their ship for 200 years. The atmosphere shifted from the sterile offices of the city to the brutalist decay of the sea, where the air was thick with the smell of rotting kelp and the constant, rhythmic pounding of the Atlantic waves against the metal graveyard. To board the ship was to enter a language of isolation, where the inhabitants were not just physically separated from the world, but lost in a temporal and linguistic cage. In this 24th part of the history, the mission was one of interpreting the echo. As the protagonist climbed the barnacle-encrusted ramps and navigated the rusted interior of the freighter, they were met with a fierce, territorial aggression. This was the era of the accidental raider, where the sole survivor realized that the ghouls defending the ship were not motivated by a desire for loot or power, but by a primal defensive instinct. The atmosphere was one of haunting confusion, as the sailors screamed warnings in Norwegian, shouting, "Leave us alone," and "We are staying here," phrases the protagonist could not understand, yet the desperation in their voices was universal. The hero moved through the dark, waterlogged cargo holds, realizing that for this crew, the war had never truly ended. They were still protecting their vessel from an invading force that had long since turned to dust. The exploration of the upper decks was a story of the ghostly watch. The protagonist found small domestic touches amidst the scrap, hand-carved tokens, tattered photos from a country across the sea, and small gardens growing in rusted buckets. This was the weight of the endless vigil, where the passage of 2 centuries had reduced a proud crew to a pack of territorial wraiths. The atmosphere on the bridge was a tableau of displacement, with the skeletal remains of the captain still slumped over the navigation charts. The sole survivor realized that these were not the monsters they had fought in the city. They were marooned witnesses to a world that had forgotten they ever existed. To fight them felt less like a battle and more like an execution of the forgotten. This period was also marked by the tragedy of the misunderstanding. Because the protagonist and the sailors could not communicate, the encounter inevitably ended in blood. This was the irony of the survivor, where the hero, seeking to clear the coast for the safety of the settlements, had to extinguish the last living connection to a culture that had survived the apocalypse in a metal box. The 24th movement reveals the vulnerability of the stranger, showing that in the wasteland, the inability to speak the same language is as lethal as a loaded gun. The hero stood over the fallen ghouls, the Norwegian words still ringing in the air like a requiem for the displaced, realizing that they had just destroyed a family that had stayed loyal to each other for 2 centuries. The 24th part of this history is defined by the solitude of the coast. As the protagonist stood on the prow of the ship, looking out over the gray, churning waters toward the horizon, the atmosphere of the Commonwealth felt incalculably vast. This was the era of the wanderer's grief, where the hero acknowledged that not every story in the wastes can be solved with a quest or a settlement. The 24th movement shows the protagonist as the silent witness to the unseen, a man who carried the memory of the Norwegian sailors back to the land, ensuring that their 200-year watch was finally recorded in the annals of the New World. The 24th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor descending from the rusted ship, their boots crunching on the wet sand of the beach. The lament of the marooned had added a layer of profound, quiet tragedy to their journey. They had conquered the machines, the corporations, and the mercenaries, but they could not conquer the distance between 2 human souls. As the tide began to come in, swallowing the footprints on the shore, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the secrets of the deep. As they investigated the submerged submarine of the Yangtze, encountering a survivor who had been waiting in the dark even longer than the sailors. The 25th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is Atonement Beneath the Waves, a journey into the dark, silt-heavy waters of Boston Harbor to find the source of a mysterious, rhythmic tapping. After the maritime tragedy of the Northern Star, the sole survivor followed the signal to a periscope cutting through the surface, leading to the discovery of the Yangtze, a pre-war Chinese nuclear submarine. This chapter is defined by the encounter with Captain Zhao, a ghoulified officer who had remained at his station for 2 centuries, trapped in a steel coffin of his own making. The atmosphere shifted from the open, salt-sprayed coast to the claustrophobic guilt of the submarine's interior, where the air was thick with the hum of a failing reactor and the heavy, stagnant scent of old radiation. To board the Yangtze was to face the ghost of the enemy, meeting the man whose missiles had likely helped burn the world the protagonist once knew. In this 25th part of the history, the mission was one of technological resuscitation. Captain Zhao, weary and ancient, did not want a war. He wanted to go home. This was the era of the bilateral forgiveness, where the hero had to decide if they could help the person who had played a role in the destruction of their family. The atmosphere was one of mutual exhaustion, as the 2 survivors of 2077 stood in the dim, red light of the command deck. 2 relics of a dead conflict, realizing that the ideologies that had fueled their war were now nothing more than dust. The protagonist agreed to help Zhao repair his vessel, navigating the flooded, radioactive lower decks to retrieve dampening coils and a warhead from a fallen comrade who had turned feral. Exploration of the flooded decks was a story of the weight of the deep. The protagonist fought through the feral crew the men Zhao had once led, now reduced to screeching shadows in the dark. This was the sacrifice of the commander, where the hero witnessed the emotional toll of Zhao's 200-year vigil, watching his friends rot while he remained the sole guardian of their mission. The atmosphere was one of submerged mourning, as the sole survivor retrieved the necessary components from the waterlogged machinery. The hero realized that the Yangtze was not a weapon anymore, but a reliquary, a floating tomb that contained the last remnants of a civilization that had been the Commonwealth's greatest rival. This period was also marked by the moral mirror. By choosing to help Zhao instead of destroying the sub, the protagonist participated in an act of trans-Pacific redemption. This was the breaking of the cycle, where the hatred of the pre-war era was finally extinguished in the quiet work of repairing an engine. The 25th movement reveals the universality of the survivor, showing that whether a person came from a vault in Boston or a submarine from Beijing, the desire for home and peace was the same. The hero stood on the deck as the reactor hummed back to life, the blue glow reflecting in Zhao's clouded eyes, a symbol that even the deepest wounds of history can eventually begin to scar over. The 25th part of this history is defined by the parting of the pillars. As the Yangtze prepared to submerge and begin its long, uncertain journey back to China, Zhao gifted the protagonist a series of homing beacons, transmitters that could call down a tactical strike from the sub's remaining non-nuclear missiles. This was the legacy of the ally, where the enemy of the past became the secret weapon of the present. The atmosphere of the harbor felt temporally cleansed as the massive black shape of the submarine slowly vanished beneath the waves. The 25th movement shows the protagonist as the peace-bringer of the abyss, a man who had looked into the eyes of the apocalypse and chosen to help it sail away. The 25th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing on the docks of the Shamrock Taffhouse, watching the ripples where the Yangtze had been. The atonement beneath the waves had provided a strange, unexpected closure to the story of the Great War. They had seen the faces of those who pulled the triggers and found only a tired old man wanting to see his shores again. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, golden fingers across the water, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the secrets of the Cabot house as they investigated a family that had survived the centuries not through radiation or cryogenics, but through a dark, eldritch secret that predated the war itself. The 26th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the Eldritch Heritage, a sharp detour from the mechanical and nuclear concerns of the wasteland into the realm of the ancient and the inexplicable. In the heart of the Boston ruins, the sole survivor encountered the Cabot house, a pristine pre-war mansion that seemed untouched by the passing of 2 centuries. This chapter is defined by the encounter with Jack Cabot, a man who possessed the speech and mannerisms of the 19th century, and his family, who appeared unnaturally youthful. The atmosphere shifted from the gritty survivalism of the streets to the Gothic sophistication of a family that had cheated time not through technology, but through a dark, biological secret. To enter the Cabot house was to step into a temporal bubble, where the primary concern was not the next meal, but the containment of a primordial force locked away in a secret asylum. In this 26th part of the history, the mission was one of archaeological dread. The protagonist was tasked with retrieving a stolen shipment of mysterious serum from a group of raiders at Parsons State Insane Asylum. This was the era of the blood of the ancients, where the hero discovered that the Cabots' immortality was fueled by a substance extracted from their father, Lorenzo Cabot. Lorenzo had been possessed by an alien artifact discovered in the Arabian desert long before the Great War, granting him godlike power at the cost of his sanity. The atmosphere was one of Lovecraftian intrusion, as the sole survivor realized that while the world had been busy with nuclear physics, a far older and more alien threat had been simmering beneath the surface of the Commonwealth. The journey to Parsons State Insane Asylum was a story of the siege of the supernatural. The protagonist fought through the mercenary guards and the raiders who sought the serum for its regenerative properties. This was the weight of the forbidden knowledge. As the hero delved into the lower levels of the asylum, where Lorenzo was held in a massive, vibrating containment field. The atmosphere within the prison was one of psychic static, the air heavy with the telekinetic pressure exerted by the prisoner. The sole survivor had to navigate the moral labyrinth of the family. Jack Cabot, the son who kept his father imprisoned to harvest his blood, or Lorenzo, the patriarch who promised the gift of eternal life in exchange for his freedom. This period was also marked by the judgment of the immortal. The protagonist stood before the levers of the containment field, forced to choose between clinical control and chaos unbound. If the hero chose to help Jack, they participated in the execution of the source, killing Lorenzo and ending the family's immortality to prevent a psychic apocalypse. The atmosphere was one of final mortality, as the Cabots rapidly aged before the hero's eyes, finally paying the debt they owed to time. Alternatively, freeing Lorenzo led to the ascension of the king, where the protagonist became an ally to a godlike being who viewed the post-war world as his rightful playground. The 26th movement reveals the hubris of the human race, showing that even before the bombs, humanity was already tampering with forces it could never hope to understand. The 26th part of this history is defined by the serum's burden. Whether the hero walked away with a supply of the life-extending serum or the friendship of a mad god, the atmosphere of the Commonwealth felt strangely small. This was the era of the cosmic realization, where the protagonist acknowledged that the war for the Commonwealth was just a flicker in the eye of a much older universe. The 26th movement shows the protagonist as the warden of the weird, a man who now carried a secret that made the Institute's synths look like children's toys. They had touched the edge of the infinite and returned to the mud of the wasteland, forever changed by the echo of the crown. The 26th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing outside the gates of the Cabot house, the high walls of the mansion casting a long shadow over the street. The Eldritch heritage had introduced a layer of mythic horror to their saga. They had seen the end of a family that had lasted for centuries, and the power of an artifact that predated humanity itself. As the fog began to roll in from the harbor, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the ruins of the university as they investigated the secret of the CIT basement and the lost projects that had been abandoned when the world turned into a graveyard. The 27th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the echo of University Point, a somber investigation into the skeletal remains of a once thriving trading hub and center of learning. After the cosmic horrors of the Cabot family, the sole survivor was drawn to the coastal ruins of what used to be a satellite campus of the CIT. This chapter is defined by the discovery of the digital ghost, the recorded memory of Jacqueline Spencer, a young woman whose brilliance unintentionally brought about the destruction of her entire community. The atmosphere shifted from the grand mysteries of the desert to the domestic tragedy of the shore, where the rusted car frames and the collapsed lecture halls told a story of a town that was erased not by the Great War, but by the Institute's cold curiosity. To walk through University Point was to enter a post-mortem of a massacre, retracing the steps of a girl who found a secret that was too big for the world to let her keep. In this 27th part of the history, the mission was one of academic recovery. The protagonist navigated through the ruins, following a trail of data logs that detailed Jacqueline's discovery of a pre-war experimental reactor design stored in the university's hard drives. This was the era of the lethal breakthrough, where the hero learned how the Institute had demanded the technology and how the town's refusal to surrender it led to their total annihilation at the hands of Kellogg and a synth army. The atmosphere was one of silent indictment, the scorched remains of the market square serving as a monument to the price of knowledge in the wasteland. The sole survivor realized that the subterranean utopia they had visited was built on the literal ashes of the very people who shared their intellectual spirit. The exploration of the Sedgwick Hall was a story of the final grade. The protagonist fought through the mirelurks and the lingering synth patrols that still guarded the data, reaching the hidden room where the experimental reactor research was kept. This was the weight of the unfinished thesis, as the hero retrieved the limitless potential laser rifle, a prototype weapon that utilized the reactor technology to never run out of ammunition. The atmosphere within the computer labs was a time capsule of ambition, with the terminals still glowing with the equations of a girl who just wanted to help her town grow. The 27th movement reveals the cruelty of the monopoly, showing how the Institute would rather bury a discovery in the dirt than allow the surface world to possess the means to rebuild. This period was also marked by the reclamation of the record. As the protagonist downloaded the final logs, they heard the last, desperate transmissions of the townspeople as the synths breached their walls. This was the eulogy for the intelligent, where the hero acknowledged that for every general or elder in the Commonwealth, there were a dozen people like Jacqueline whose names were being erased by the tides. The 27th movement shows the protagonist as the archivist of the lost, a man who refused to let the Institute's crimes stay hidden in the shadows of the coast. They took the technology not for an empire, but as a stolen fire, a reminder that the spirit of human ingenuity cannot be fully extinguished, even by a mountain of concrete and a legion of machines. The 27th part of this history is defined by the solitude of the campus. As the protagonist stood on the edge of the university docks, Looking out at the murky water, the atmosphere of the Commonwealth felt intellectually orphaned. This was the era of the vindication of the fallen, where the hero carried the research back to the surface, deciding whether to share the power of the reactor with their allies or to keep it as a private tool for the defense of the innocent. The 20th Seventh Movement reveals the legacy of the spark, showing that even in a world of scrap and rust, a single good idea can still change the course of history, provided there is someone left to read the data. The 27th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor leaving a single pre-war flower on the desk where Jacqueline had worked. The echo of University Point had reinforced the hero's resolve to never let the past's mistakes dictate the future's potential. They had seen the cost of secrets and the price of progress. As the wind whistled through the empty window frames of the library, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the secrets of the Sentinel site. As they traveled to the heart of the glowing sea to uncover the final ordnance and the ultimate fate of the pre-war nuclear stockpile, the 28th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the pilgrimage to the ground zero, a journey back into the heart of the glowing sea to the Sentinel site. After witnessing the tragic loss of knowledge at University Point, the sole survivor turned toward the source of the world's end, a massive, pyramid-shaped pre-war bunker that housed the arsenal of the end times. This chapter is defined by the veneration of the bomb. As the protagonist navigated the most radioactive landscape in the world to reach the primary nuclear stockpile of the United States, the atmosphere shifted from the salty air of the coast to the acidic haze of the crater, where the sky was a permanent, bruised yellow, and the wind carried the taste of ozone and ancient dust. To enter the Sentinel site was to descend into the womb of the apocalypse, exploring the very place where the fire that destroyed the world was born and stored. In this 28th part of the history, the mission was one of theological demolition. The protagonist discovered that the bunker had become a holy site for a splinter cell of the children of Adam, led by Brother Henry. Unlike the peaceful pilgrims in the crater, these guardians viewed the nuclear warheads as seeds of division and were prepared to die to prevent anyone from tampering with their gods. This was the era of the nuclear altar, where the sole survivor had to navigate the vertical shafts of the facility while fending off the radiated sentinels, both human and machine. The atmosphere was one of sacred dread, as the rhythmic clicking of the Geiger counter merged with the chanting of the cultists, creating a symphony of atomic worship. The hero realized that the bunker was a temple of the void, a place where the pre-war military's power had been reclaimed as a post-war religion. The exploration of the lower silos was a story of the weight of the final ordnance. The protagonist found rows of Mark 28 nuclear bombs, still functional and waiting for a command that would never come. This was the burden of the trigger, as the hero had to secure these weapons to either bolster the the Brotherhood of Steel's final weapon, Liberty Prime, or to ensure that no one could ever use them again. The atmosphere within the silo was a frozen moment in 1945, a reminder that the world's end was a calculated industrial process. The sole survivor stood among the steel coffins of civilization, realizing that the Great War was not a distant event, but a lingering presence that was still being guarded by the very people it had transformed. This period was also marked by the reckoning with the general. If the protagonist chose to take the warheads, they were forced to dismantle the cult, eternal vigil, realizing that one man's weapon is another man's god. This was the sacrifice of the sacred, where the hero acknowledged that to build a new world, they might have to desecrate the symbols of the old one. The 28th movement reveals the indifference of the atom, showing that the power contained within the bunker cared nothing for the prayers of the children or the strategies of the Brotherhood. The hero acted as the hand of the reset, removing the teeth of the old world to prevent the second great fire. The 28th part of this history is defined by the ascent from the abyss. Emerging from the sentinel site with the codes and the ordnance secured, the protagonist looked back at the pyramid as it was swallowed by the yellow fog. The atmosphere of the glowing sea felt profoundly empty, a realization that the source of all the Commonwealth's pain was just a collection of metal and math. This was the era of the sobering victory, where the hero carried the weight of the end of the world in their hands. The 28th movement shows the protagonist as the master of the silo, the only person who truly understood that the new world was still living in the shadow of the Cold War's last breath. The 28th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor standing at the edge of the glowing sea, where the yellow dust meets the brown earth of the Commonwealth. The pilgrimage to Ground Zero had stripped away the last of the wasteland's mystery. They had touched the bombs and spoken to their priests. As the first clean raindrops began to fall, washing the acidic dust from their armor, the protagonist prepared for the next movement. The focus would shift to the secrets of the coastline as they investigated the Grand Hotel and the final mystery of the mist, seeking to understand if there was any place left in the world that was truly free of the shadow of the atom. The 29th movement in the Chronicle of the Commonwealth is the Gilded Illusion, a journey to the ruins of the Grand Hotel and the surrounding luxury estates that once catered to the elite of Boston. After touching the cold, industrial reality of the nuclear silos, the sole survivor was drawn to the skeletal remains of high society, a world where the wealthy had attempted to buy their way out of the apocalypse. This chapter is defined by the discovery of the luxury tomb, where the mahogany furniture and velvet curtains had been preserved by the dry air, even as the people within them turned to dust. The atmosphere shifted from the acidic yellow of the glowing sea to a haunting opulence, where the sound of the wind through broken chandeliers sounded like the ghostly laughter of 1,000 cocktail parties. To enter the Grand Hotel was to witness the bankruptcy of privilege. Realizing that no amount of pre-war wealth could stop the clock from striking midnight. In this 29th part of the history, the mission was one of social archaeology. The protagonist navigated the high-rise suites and the grand ballrooms, following a trail of holotapes that detailed the final hours of the Boston Inner Circle. This was the era of the exclusive end, where the hero learned how the socialites had retreated into their private bunkers, drinking the finest wines and wearing their best silks as the air sirens began to wail. The atmosphere was one of pathetic denial, the terminals revealing a world where the primary concern during the fall of civilization was the loss of a catering contract or the social standing of a neighbor. The sole survivor realized that while the common people had huddled in the mud of the streets, the architects of society had spent their final moments in a cocaine-fueled apathy, shielded by walls of marble and glass that eventually became their headstones. The exploration of the executive penthouse was a story of the last champagne. The protagonist fought through the automated security systems, protectrons dressed in tattered tuxedos, to reach the private vault of the hotel's owner. This was the weight of the empty ledger, as the hero retrieved a collection of pre-war stock certificates and heirloom jewelry that were now worth less than a handful of bottle caps. The atmosphere within the vault was a silent comedy of greed, with the skeletons of the elite still clutching their gold as if they could take it with them into the afterlife. The 29th movement reveals the equality of the atom, showing that the fire did not care for bank accounts or lineage. It reduced the penthouse and the tenement to the same pile of gray ash. This period was also marked by the reclamation of the human cost. As the protagonist stood on the balcony of the hotel, looking out over the ruins of the city, they found a small, handwritten diary belonging to a young maid who had worked until the very end. This was the voice of the servant, providing a stark contrast to the narcissistic logs of the guests. The 29th movement shows the protagonist as the judge of the Gilded Age, a man who recognized that the true strength of the Commonwealth lay not in the preserved luxury of the few, but in the gritty resilience of the many. They took the artifacts of the past not for their vanity, but as a history of the hubris, a reminder that a society that prioritizes the comfort of the elite over the safety of the whole is destined to end in a symphony of ruin. The 29th part of this history is defined by the sunset over the skyline. As the protagonist left the Grand Hotel, the atmosphere of the Commonwealth felt strangely heavy. This was the era of the final reflection, where the hero acknowledged that the American dream had been a hollow shell long before the bombs fell. The 29th movement reveals the clarity of the wreckage, showing that the wasteland was actually a more honest world than the one it had replaced. The hero stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 years of consumption, realizing that they were the first person in 2 centuries to truly see the gilded illusion for what it was, a beautiful, lethal lie. The 29th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor walking away from the neon-lit shadow of the hotel and heading toward the Starlight Drive-In. The focus was shifting to the final movement of the 30-part saga, the reunion of the Commonwealth. They had seen the past, the present, and the potential future now. It was time to bring all the pieces together. As the moon rose over the city of diamonds, the protagonist prepared for the conclusion of the legend, ready to face the final question of what kind of world would rise from the ashes they had spent so long treading. The 30th movement in the chronicle of the Commonwealth is the legacy of the sole survivor, a period of profound stillness following the thunderous wars and the uncovering of ancient secrets. After traveling from the frozen silence of Vault 111 to the neon heights of Nuka World, and from the radioactive deep of the Yangtze to the gilded tombs of the elite, the protagonist returned to the very beginning, the bridge leading into Sanctuary Hills. This chapter is defined by the Great Integration, as the hero stood at the center of a web of trade routes, fortified settlements, and unified factions. The atmosphere shifted from the frantic survival of a parent searching for a child to the measured responsibility of a leader. To walk the roads of the Commonwealth now was to witness a world that had been pulled back from the brink of total collapse by the hands of a single, displaced soul. In this 30th part of the history, the mission was one of reflective architecture. The protagonist looked upon the thriving gardens of Abernathy Farm, the steel towers of the castle, and the buzzing markets of Diamond City. This was the era of the Pax Commonwealth, where the disparate souls of the wasteland, human, ghoul, and synth had found a fragile but functioning rhythm. The atmosphere was one of vigilant hope. The sound of the Minutemen, radio no longer a desperate plea for help, but a steady heartbeat of order. The sole survivor realized that their journey had never truly been about finding Sean, but about finding a future for a world that had been standing still for 2 centuries. The search for a son had ended in the discovery of a people, and the grief of a lost family had been transformed into the protection of 1,000 others. The exploration of the final mental map was a story of the weight of the crown. The protagonist stood on the roof of the rebuilt sanctuary, looking at the pre-war house where it all began. This was the closure of the circle, where the hero acknowledged the ghosts of the past, Nora or Nate, the neighbors, and the life that was stolen. The atmosphere was a symphony of the scarred, as the hero realized that while they could never truly go back to 2077, they had built something authentically new. The 20th 30th movement reveals the solitude of the general, showing that the cost of peace was a memory that only the protagonist truly carried. They were the only bridge left between the world that was and the world that is, a living archive of a civilization that had finally stopped mourning its own death and started living its own life. This period was also marked by the judgment of the legend. as the stories of the sole survivor were told around campfires from the glowing sea to Far Harbor, the protagonist had to decide their final signature. Would they be remembered as the vengeful father, the benevolent overseer, or the scourge of the raiders? This was the final choice of the soul, a realization that their actions had become the new mythology of the wastes. The atmosphere was one of historical finality, as the hero took their seat at the head of the table, not as a master, but as a guardian of the gate. The 30th movement shows the protagonist as the engineer of the new dawn, a man out of time who had finally found his place in the clockwork of the universe. The 30th part of this history is defined by the sunset of the chronicle. As the protagonist watched the sun dip below the horizon of the Commonwealth, the light catching the gleaming armor of the patrols and the wind vanes of the farms, the atmosphere felt profoundly earned. This was the era of the resting blade, where the hero acknowledged that the wars were over, but the work of living was just beginning. The 30th movement reveals the clarity of the horizon, showing that while the world was still broken, it was no longer shattered. The hero stood as the anchor of the Atlantic, a figure of iron and empathy who had turned a graveyard into a garden. The 30th movement of the chronicle ends with the sole survivor sitting by a fire in the center of Sanctuary, the Vault-Tec representative, and Preston Garvey nearby, sharing a quiet moment of peace. The legacy of the sole survivor was not written in the blood of the Institute or the steel of the Brotherhood, but in the silence of the guns and the laughter of the children. The 30-part saga was complete, the map was cleared, and the story of the Commonwealth had found its hero. As the stars came out, shining bright and indifferent over the ruins, and the settlements alike, the protagonist closed their eyes, finally home.